You're an eyewitness to my majesty. Ladies and gentlemen, we are MythVision, and today we're delving into eyewitness testimony in the Gospel of John. And our special guest is going to be Dr. Jef Tripp, his professional name, if you will. We'll have him introduce himself in just a moment, but I have to give a quick shameless plug. We can use your help here at MythVision. I am currently finishing up part 2. We already have part 1 with Paula Fredrickson. That is out. It is on the Patreon. Number 1 is on the Patreon. And of course, now I am editing part 2 and we're wrapping that up. That'll be on Patreon, hopefully today. For everybody who's interested in helping us out, go check it out. Dr. Tripp, welcome to MythVision. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm looking forward to today's discussion. I do want to give a little bit of a plug for your material for those who are interested in diving deeper. He has published an academic book here that is direct internal quotation in the Gospel of John. I will not try to pronounce that German. I think that's German, the way that that's spelled. So, and if I may, just to tease people, yes, it's very expensive. So if you can't afford it, don't buy it. You're going to get a tease of what it is about today. Characters in the Gospel of John quote and re-quote each other frequently, almost excessively, yet their quotations are rarely literal. These characters, including Jesus and the narrator, make changes, some minor, some major. Even when they re-quote important sayings of Jesus, Jef Tripp examines this often overlooked feature of the fourth gospel in the context of first century pedagogy. I always mess this one up. And literature, as well as early Christian tradition and practices. Attending to John's direct internal quotations reveals a text at play with its Christological and eschatological language. Teasing out the fullest extent of its meaning, the Gospel of John emerges as a theological narrative anchored in yet unbound by the ideas of the wider early Christian movement. So check out his book on Amazon. It is in MythVision recommended reading list. He also has an academia page in the description. Go follow him there. Read and watch some of the videos he does because he has a YouTube channel, Doubters Commentary. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Show some love to our academics. We see 137 right now. When we get done with this live here, Dr. Tripp, I do want to check and see where we're at on the subscribers. So let's hope we can get some subscribers. MythVision's working our butt off here to bring you content. Please, we really can use your help. If you've considered it, you sat on the fence, today's the day to jump over the fence. Come on and join. We really, really could use the help. I'm working hard, and we're about to be going to Israel too. So all that content that I get in Israel of Pontius Pilate, where his judgment seat was, or where we go to see John the Baptist's grave, or we go to the Dead Sea, or we go to Masada, or I'm going through Hezekiah's tunnel. All of this stuff from Israel will be on the Patreon for those who support us. Help us out. It's not like you're just giving handouts. You're receiving content, early access, direct messaging, the whole nine. We also have a course with M. David Litwell on the ancient Greek mysteries. If you don't know about those, go sign up for the course. And Finding Moses with Bart Ehrman is another one that we're launching. We got a bunch of stuff down in the description. Help us out by going down there and checking it out. Dr. Tripp, some of our audience has seen you, probably a little bit here and there, especially if they're Patreon members, because I've launched that material there. But can you introduce yourself, your academic background, and what we're going to get into today?
my background started in math. So our last conversation was very math focused. But I went on to do a doctorate in New Testament and early Christianity. Often what I look at is the Gospel of John. So the Gospel of John is sort of my focus, and that's where we'll focus here, even though my work in this area has sort of touched on all four of the Gospels.
Your volume's just a smidge low.
Okay.
There
Can
we
you
go.
hear me
There we
now?
go. That's a little bit better.
So I'm looking at I focus on the Gospel of John and then the sort of reception of the Gospel of John. So how have people read it differently over the centuries? So we get into a fantastic example of reception history early today. And my interest in this particular field, I reviewed a book that made this claim about John being an eyewitness to the ministry of Jesus. And after I reviewed the book, I decided I had to write an article in response. And so a lot of the material today comes from my article in response, but it also comes from a number of other critics who have sort of raised objections to this claim that John was a direct eyewitness and that it was written by a direct eyewitness.
Is it fair to say, just so we're moving into this, I know we're going to get deep because your PowerPoint's going to present this. Does the Gospel of John, you could see why Christians say, oh, it's eyewitness, because the Gospel of John claims in the Gospel in certain places to be, this author is saying, this is true. I've seen this, and in fact, if I wrote all the things Jesus had done, the world couldn't contain them, right? So it is claiming to be an eyewitness, and I'm sure, and I'm being devil's advocate to you, you're critical, which I really believe like you do about this, but why would you reject John's clear claim to being an eyewitness to these things, right? So we need to, we're going to have a good reason to respond to this as we go through this presentation. And for those who've heard apologists say this many times, I've heard it a ton of times, and it gets passed around in apologetics for the confidence of what we're reading is sincerely, historically reliable, right down to the what happened with Jesus. We're going to learn something today, I suspect.
And one of the things I hope we learn is that equating those two things, that just because it comes from an eyewitness, even if we granted that, doesn't always mean that it is historically reliable. So those are two separate questions.
There's layers to the onion. So do we want to start your presentation?
Yeah.
Okay. So as we're getting in, go subscribe to this YouTube channel. I will be checking to see whether you've been naughty or nice. And you can either get coal or you can get presents at the end of this live stream. And so let's start this thing. Dr. Tripp.
So the person, the academic who really gets the ball rolling on this claim that John was written by an eyewitness is Richard Bauckham in his book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. So traditionally, this is the claim of the church, that John was one of the two written by an eyewitness. Matthew's the other one. And that was largely dismissed in a lot of academic circles until 2006, when the first edition of Jesus and the Eyewitnesses came out. And then a second edition that's even longer came out in 2017. So it's not a little book. It's a big book. So he put in his work. I feel like, I should start by giving him his due, that he put in a lot of work. He amassed a lot of evidence in support of this, and he came up with some creative arguments. Do all of them work? Well, I wouldn't have written an article in response critiquing his book if I thought they all worked. But he definitely put in the work, and he got the conversation rolling. So I would also say that his central thesis is solid. So there's sort of what he argues at its core versus how he expands it. And it's when he expands it that things get a little weak. So I want to spend a minute or two at the beginning on his central thesis, which is really against the form critics. And we don't really need to get into all the technicalities of the form critics or form criticism, but form criticism is responsible for this sort of telephone game image of how oral tradition about Jesus was passed on in the pre-textual stage. So the 40 years between Jesus dying and Mark writing a gospel. So a typical situation that you would hear in a form critical work is, say, Philip comes to town. And so Philip's an eyewitness to some of this stuff. And the form critics, like Bauckham, basically trusted that eyewitness testimony would be reliable. But Philip comes to town, he stays with you for, 2 weeks. And he tells you some stories about Jesus. He tells you some teachings of Jesus. He gets you on board. And then Philip leaves. And you never see Philip again. He's on to the next town converting people. So now you're stuck in this village with an oral memory of the stories about Jesus or the teachings of Jesus. And you start telling them. So say I'm the bigwig in this village, and I'm the one who's going to tell these stories from now on. Well, I'm going to get some details wrong. Or I'm going to make some embellishments as I tell the story. Or I'm going to repurpose the story to something that's relevant to me. So maybe the story was originally about trusting God, but now I want to make it about how awesome Jesus is. So in repurposing that story, maybe I alter it a bit. And then I pass it on to you. So I tell you these stories, complete with all my errors and embellishments and all that. So now when you tell the next person, you're not only bringing in all of my distortions, but you're adding your own distortions. And over 40 years, the distortions add up so much that the stories don't really tell us anything about Jesus. If anything, they tell us about the communities who told these stories, because they would only tell these stories if they were relevant to them. Now, this is a complete digression, but I love this example because in late history, we have a just perfect example of what this process looks like when it's allowed to play out. If you go to Shingo, Japan, you can go to Jesus Christ's tomb because there's a story there that Jesus wasn't crucified, his brother Isukiri was, and he left Jerusalem. He wanders around Asia for a while, ends up in Shingo, Japan, and where he settles down, he gets married, he has 3 daughters, and he dies a peaceful death at the ripe old age of 106. It's perfect because what happened is Jesuits come in and convert this little village. So they play the role of, say, Philip. They come in, they convert this village. I have no reason to believe the Jesuits told them a weird story about Jesus. They probably told them the biblical story about Jesus. But then the Jesuits get kicked out of Japan. So they leave and are never to be seen again, or at least not to be seen again for a couple centuries. So you have an isolated village that has stories that they remember more or less well about Jesus. And over the generations, the story gets distorted and distorted and distorted, and Jesus becomes more and more relevant to them. So you have a culture that venerates ancestors. Jesus becomes an ancestor. He has a burial mound, just like any of our ancestors that we would venerate. He doesn't die a gruesome death in some random far-off empire. He dies a peaceful death at an old age, like any wise sage should do. Like being crucified at 30 is not a death becoming of a wise person. So he doesn't die that death. Somebody else does. So we have this like perfect encapsulation of how form criticism said things would play out. Now, in the first century, they're not going to turn him into an ancestor. They're not going to relocate him to Japan, but they might say, well, we venerate gods and heroes, so maybe there's pressure to turn Jesus into a god or a hero. And so that pushes the story in a new direction that maybe the original eyewitnesses would not have agreed. So this is essentially the telephone game is how form criticism portrays this. How Bauckham might come back at this is to point out a couple things. First of all, there weren't villages that isolated in the Roman Empire in the first century, or if there were, they were very rare. What we're really starting to realize now is how networked early Christianity was. So Paul doesn't just convert you and then leave and never talk to you again. Paul writes you letters. And in one of his letters to the Galatians, he talks about James sending people out from Jerusalem. So you have the people who visited are still in contact. You have the people in Jerusalem are sending people out. If you were from, say, Macedonia and you wanted to go to Syria, who are you going to stay with? You're probably going to find the local Christians and stay with them. So there's a lot of networking in early Christianity, which means these totally isolated villages, which is the model of form criticism, the Markan community or the Matthean community, they're not going to be as isolated as form criticism imagined. The other thing is the eyewitnesses didn't die the day Jesus died. They were alive for sometimes decades after Jesus died. So even the early ones that got killed lived into the 40s. So that cuts the 40 years down by about a quarter. Peter doesn't die into the 50s, so that means less than half of the time is available for this. So that 40 years, one, is not the centuries the people in Shingo, Japan had. Even that 40 years gets narrowed and narrowed and narrowed because you still have these eyewitnesses around as well. Does that make sense so far?
Yes, I'm just muting so that your audio is on point, but yes.
Okay. So this is his central thesis, and I think that is solid. That he muddles the image of the form critics. That's still lingering, even though everybody's form criticism isn't really popular anymore. It's hard to find a person who practices form criticism anymore. But this telephone game image of how oral tradition was passed on is still very popular. So had he written just a slim little 120-page book focusing on this central thesis and focusing on just how networked and how little time people had, I mean, on the one hand, he wouldn't have nearly half as many critics coming back at him and criticizing his book. On the other hand, he also wouldn't have people like pastors and preachers holding up Jesus and the eyewitnesses in church like we have stories about. So we have stories about preachers holding up this book and saying, see, it's based on eyewitness testimony. So he wouldn't have connected with a Christian audience the way that he did if he had written that slim little version of the book, focusing just on this thesis. So in order to get from this thesis to where somebody's holding his book up in the middle of church, we have to add the fact that he wants the testimony to be reliable. So that's also important to him. It's not just that the method for passing along the information is different than the form critics imagine. He wants you to be able to trust the information that you get. And he admits it some places in his introduction and whatnot, that this is also important to Christians. It's not a completely neutral academic desire on his part, that it is something that he's doing for the Christian community. So in trying to make it reliable, he extends it in 3 ways, which sort of spread his evidence thin. And this is where we get into what we want to talk about, which is whether or not John is written by an eyewitness. So he actually makes 3 different arguments, or he makes three different claims. So three levels of connection to the eyewitnesses. So first of all, the Gospels reflect the oral storytelling habits of the eyewitnesses because they were written, in John's case, by an eyewitness. In Mark and Matthew's case, by somebody close to an eyewitness. So doesn't claim Matthew was an eyewitness, but he says somebody who knew Matthew wrote Matthew. And then in Luke's case, using the best historiographic method, so going out and interviewing eyewitnesses. So this is where he wants to sort of shorten the cord. He still imagines a sort of telephone game going on. He just wants fewer and fewer steps between the beginning, where you have the eyewitnesses, and the end, where you have the gospel. In the case of John, he makes three arguments in support of the idea that John was an eyewitness. One is traditional, one is a tweak to a traditional argument, and then one is his own argument that he makes up, like it's his own creation. So the first is what you mentioned at the outset. John just says he's an eyewitness. Like, you have to stand up to that claim. So at the end of the gospel, this is the disciple who testifies about these things and who wrote them. So that's a strong claim, and you have to deal with that claim if you're going to claim that the opposite, that John wasn't written by an eyewitness. So the idea here is he just says it straight out, and we should trust him. So that's what Bauckham asks us to do. It's a claim to be an eyewitness. We should trust that claim. It seems very simple at the outset that effectively John, and he does ascribe it to a John, just not John the son of Zebedee. We'll get to that. But John is making a third person claim about himself. So John wrote the whole thing, and then he refers to himself in the third person by saying, this is the disciple who testifies and who wrote them. So who testifies through the text now instead of through oral storytelling, and who wrote this gospel. When you start to pick at it, though, this gets a lot more complicated. So it's not just that he would have to refer to himself in the third person singular. There's a mess of persons here, a mess of persons in number. So he would have to refer to him, this is the disciple. We, which includes him, know his testimony is true. And I, which is also we, which is also him, suppose that the world itself could not hold the books that were written. I mean, and what Bauckham highlights is all three of these can be, like, authors and eyewitnesses can refer to themselves in the third person singular, they can refer to themselves in the first person plural, and they can refer to themselves in the first person singular. But all three right on top of each other is very, very unlikely. So it just doesn't seem as likely. Yes, if we had one of those, we might be like, okay, we can make sense of that. But if we have all three of them cluttering each other up, it becomes very difficult to understand why his brain just sort of farted at the end of the gospel and he's just making this jumble of persons right at the end when you're finishing up the gospel. It becomes much easier to understand if a third party is writing about him and referring to him in the third person and refers to himself in the first person as we and then I. So having the I included in the we is a lot easier to swallow than having the I and the he and the we all identified as the same person. So even just the straightforward claim about, like, well, this is, when you sort of pick apart these two verses, becomes a little difficult to swallow. So it's possible, at the very least, that these two verses at the end were added by a third party. So maybe John wrote everything before, but then these two verses were added. So then the claim itself does not come from the eyewitness. It would come from somebody who's making the claim for him. And then you're not really trusting John or not. You're trusting this random anonymous person. Okay, so there's some issues with the persons. He also relies on this idea, well, who testifies and who wrote. So who wrote seems pretty straightforward. He wrote. And who testifies, he really focuses on the present tense there. So who testifies, in other words, this is how he tells the story. And normally you would hear it when he told you the story face to face. Now he's telling you the story in written form, but he continues to testify through the text. Well, who wrote is problematized by two passages in this text. The one that a lot of scholars would already point to is John 19, where it says, Pilate wrote a titulus, so the Jesus of the Nazarene, King of the Jews, that goes above the cross. And then later Pilate says, well, what I have written, I have written. The problem there is it doesn't seem like it would be Pilate's job to physically write it. So what he most likely means is he caused it to have been written. So he said, at the very minimum, go write a titulus. Go write the charges up on the board. Now, if Pilate dictated that, if he said, write on a piece of board, Jesus the Nazarene, King of the Jews, that would be fine. I mean, I don't think anybody would mind if John dictated the words of the gospel and physically write them. But it also allows this idea that he could have just said, write the charges. And somebody else came up with Jesus the Nazarene, King of the Jews. So if somebody else actually came up with the words, how closely do we want to identify Pilate with the author? So it becomes a little more muddled with John 19. For me, it becomes muddled with John 5 when he talks about Moses having written about Jesus. Because then that assumes that Moses is the author of the Torah, which most scholars would not agree with. So as a devotional claim, yeah, that totally makes sense. And maybe Jesus believed that. But we don't have to agree. So we can just disagree. We can just think they're wrong. And that's okay, whether intentionally wrong in a deceptive manner or just factually wrong because they're just getting the facts wrong. So it's not even as straightforward to say he wrote it, because in what sense did he mean that he wrote it? Also, this first person testifies. I won't linger on this very long, but at the beginning, this is mirrored by a claim about John the Baptist also using testify in the present tense. And again, he means it like he testifies through the gospel, so he can use the present tense in saying that I've recorded this language and it's in the gospel. So now he testifies through the gospel. The problem is John is clearly not the testimonial source of the Gospel of John. He's been dead for like 60 years. So you can say somebody testifies through the gospel without them being your eyewitness to the event. So that becomes problematic for this claim at the end of the gospel, that when he uses the present tense, he's signaling that John is the actual testimonial source for the gospel. At the bottom there, I just want to highlight that this line is quoted 3 times and none of them match. So he opens with quoting him, or saying, the one who comes after me, the strap of whose sandal I'm not worthy to untie. So sure, the one who comes after me, somebody's coming after me, he's really swell. Then in John 1:30, so the next day, he quotes himself, but he alters the phrasing. A man is coming after me. who has become ahead of me because he existed before me, or he was before me. By the time you get to the prologue, it's a conflation of those two statements. So he takes the beginning of one and the end of the other. And he does that because doing that, taking the beginning of one and the end of the other, fits the best in the context of the prologue. He can alter the phrasing of what John said to make it appropriate to the context and the purpose he's using it. So recording the words of John verbatim doesn't seem to be his big priority. And he can even say, like, I'm testifying that I said this, and then say something that he didn't literally say. So just the point. He doesn't address the idea from redaction critics that John 21 wasn't written by the author of the rest of the gospel. This is a common argument in John scholarship that the original gospel ended at the end of John 20, because it looks like it did. This looks like an ending. So Jesus did many other signs in front of his disciples, which are not written in this book. This book we're at the end of. These are written so you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and so that when you believe, you may have life in his name. Which, first of all, is a beautiful line to have in there, because John highlights that his agenda is to get you to believe, not to objectively record facts. So he has an agenda, and he's perfectly upfront about his agenda. So whoever wrote this is like, I wrote this so you'll believe, not so you have an accurate and full record of everything that Jesus did. But redaction critics have made arguments for decades that John 21 isn't original. So if John 21 isn't original, either the claim that the beloved disciple is the eyewitness and wrote these things could just be about John 21 and not about the rest of the gospel, or it starts to become suspect. It starts to become something that we should doubt. And that's why there's a really important question to ask. Could you just fake it? Like, it's fakeable. And I highlight here Jubilees, which uses similar language about testimony and testifying. So it uses this language about itself as the testimony of Moses, but nobody believes that. It also talks about First Enoch as Enoch's testimony. But again, nobody believes that. No scholars believe that, and very few modern believers would believe that First Enoch was actually written by Enoch. So you can use exactly this language of testifying to bolster the claims that you're making and to give your text authority, and yet it would be false. And Jubilees is a history that's influenced by Greek models in the same way that John is a biography that's influenced by Greek models. And so attending a claim to be eyewitness testimony helps its authority, and yet we don't have to believe it. Like, we need some other sort of corroboration to believe the claim. Just to highlight one more, I mean, we have letters in the New Testament that claim to be by Paul. There's a textual feature there that says this was written by Paul, and yet these are disputed letters. There are people that don't believe that 2 Timothy was written by Paul. Now, they don't dismiss all of Paul's letters. There are the disputed letters and there are the undisputed letters, because people genuinely believe that this core group of letters was 30 Helens agree, Paul wrote these. So it's not like they just, as soon as they see a text, they're like, pseudepigrapha. But you need corroboration. In the case of Paul, we have multiple letters that we can compare to each other and then look at how well they match. So we have corroboration. In the case of John, if all we had was just the claim that an anonymous figure, whoever the beloved disciple is, wrote these things, then that would not be strong evidence that John was actually written by an eyewitness. We would be obligated as scholars to question that claim. And Bauckham knows this. Bauckham, he's not a bad scholar. Like, he's a very good scholar. So he knows that this is the case. So he bolsters it with two more arguments. The first is he relies on some testimony from Papias that's recorded in UC. So it's worth reading at length. So, nor did I enjoy those who recall someone else's commandments, but those who remember the commandments given by the Lord to the faith and proceeding from the truth itself. And if by chance anyone who had been in attendance on the elders should come my way, I inquired about the words of the elders, what Andrew or Peter said, or Philip or Thomas or James or John or Matthew, or any other of the Lord's disciples, and whatever Aristion or the elder John, the Lord's disciples, were saying. For I did not think that information from books would profit me as much as information from a living and surviving voice. Derek, do you notice anything missing?
We're saying.
How about
help me out?
That John wrote the gospel.
Oh, it just says John. Okay, the elder John. It doesn't really tell us, it doesn't say, hey, and he wrote this gospel. It just says the elder John.
Yeah, so the elder John is mentioned, but there's no direct claim. So we don't have direct testimony about John writing the gospel until Irenaeus in 180, which is the same place we've always been. So that itself is suspect. So what he wants to do is say that John, the elder John, and so he argues that the elder John is the author of the gospel, not John the son of Zebedee. Which interestingly, then Bauckham got himself caught in the middle, so he's getting flack from the scholarly community about saying it was an eyewitness, and then he's getting flack from, say, conservative churches for not saying it was John the son of Zebedee. So he was getting hit on all sides. What Papias seems to be saying, or the way that Bauckham reads it, is that Aristion and the elder John were still preaching into his day. So that switch from the aorist Epen to the present Legusin signifies that the original disciples, the ones we recognize, did tell this when they were alive. John the elder was still saying this while I was asking around about it. So I was influenced by his direct way of telling these stories. Then he makes an argument that the way that Papias phrases this reflects how John told the stories. The way he does this is through the list of names. He says, well, this list of names of the disciples is kind of strange. So Andrew, Peter, Philip, Thomas, James, John, and Matthew. That's not an order we see in any of the synoptic gospels, which we know were in textual form before Papias was writing this. And it's not a typical way of listing off these characters. But he says, well, in John 1, we have Andrew, Peter, Philip. And in John 21, we have Peter, Thomas, the sons of Zebedee. So Peter, Thomas, James, and John. So his argument is that this odd order and this odd selection of names reflects the way that John used to tell the stories. Since that's reflected in Papias, who heard them live, and that's reflected in John, which is a text connected to the elder John, then the Gospel of John reflects the oral storytelling methods of John the Elder. So this is his argument, based on the names at least. I don't really buy it. There's something there, but there's also this issue that you're pulling from two different lists. So in order to get to the similarity of order, you have to pull from two different lists. Those aren't the only two lists in John. So you're picking two lists that happen to match the thing in Papias. The other issue is some people are omitted, some people are added. Like if you can start doing that, the likelihood of getting some names to match in order starts to go up. And it could be coincidence.
Isn't this the problem we ran into? Like you and me did a deep dive, just recognizing this interview we did on the 153 fish. And I mean, we went into, I don't know, there's probably more wild ideas out there, but like we covered, I don't know, 10 examples. I'm just throwing it out there. A lot of examples of how to make the 153 fish story make sense. Is the 153 symbolic? Is it literal? I mean, and just, you can do anything if you really want to.
Yeah. And so you have a potential coincidence. And what you want to do is say, well, it's really unlikely. If there was like a 0.0001% chance of this happening, sure, then I can say it's probably not a coincidence. But if you're pulling from multiple lists, you're choosing which information you want to care about and which information isn't convenient to you, then all of a sudden that percent chance that it could be coincidence starts to rise, and probably over 5%. So now you have a significant chance that it's a coincidence. So that's one issue, that it's not the strongest like draw between those. And it also relies on this choice of verb on Papias's part, that he went from the original, like the 12 disciples said, Aristion and the elder John were saying. Here's a problem I have. And a few pages later, Bauckham admits that, first of all, we don't have Papias. We have Eusebius quoting Papias. And he admits that even in the passages we have delimited as reporting the source, it's clear that Eusebius is not quoting, but paraphrasing. Eusebius can be quite free in his paraphrasing. So it seems then very risky to ride so much on the grammar of two verbs, because could those have been things that Eusebius was paraphrasing? I mean, if he's paraphrasing, do we know what tense of the verb Papias had in the original? Well, we don't. We're riding a lot on the idea that he switches from aorist to present, but we don't know that Papias actually did that. So that makes it even a little shakier for me. And then the last critique I'll have of his Papias argument, and I'll move on to swear. And this is not highlighted by me. This is highlighted by several other scholars. I think Alan Kirk is one of them. His contrast is not with form criticism. So it's not like I trusted the eyewitnesses, not the development of long tradition over time. It's between eyewitnesses and books. So I did not think that information from books would profit me as much as information from a living and surviving voice. So on the one hand, this is just typical historiography in the first century, that you preferred to be able to talk to somebody directly. But it does put him in a rough situation, in sort of a paradox. If we take Papias as he speaks, that he trusted eyewitnesses, he didn't trust books. Well, by the time Papias is writing, there are at least 3 gospels out there. And according to Bauckham, those 3 gospels reflect the eyewitness testimony of the eyewitnesses. So why doesn't he trust them, if that's a conclusion we can draw from this? John might already have been written by now. And so if he doesn't trust eyewitness testimony in books, why doesn't he trust John, if John is supposed to be from eyewitness testimony?
And if I might, just to throw one thing, I've heard this, that Papias literally says, like, I prefer people telling me the stories than finding them in books. And we hear quite an elaborate story about the death of Judas, and like, what is that all about? That's wild. I mean, they swelled up to the size of a cart, and the land still stinks where he died, and like all of this stuff. Anyway, it just sounds like, who made that up?
Well, yeah, so I mean that draws to like something we're going to move on to, which is just because it came from an eyewitness. So my reaction, your reaction is, it just because it came from an eyewitness doesn't mean it's reliable. Um, the example I give in the article is like if Jude is say Judas, not Iscariot, has a real trouble. He always muddles up his words and he gets details wrong and stuff. But if you run into Jude and he's one of the 12 apostles and he wants to tell you a story, are you not going to listen to him? Of course, you're going to give him authority. But that doesn't mean that Jude always gets his details right. Those are two separate questions. But yeah, Papias is following pretty standard, and Bauckham does a good job of showing this, that Papias is following standard sort of historiography from the first century, that you prefer talking to somebody who was there. You can ask them questions, you can ask for clarification. These are things you can't do with a text. But he does seem to be bagging indirectly bagging on the Gospels. If the Gospels are eyewitness testimony, then why doesn't he trust them? Couldn't somebody just say, well, this is the way Peter used to tell it, if he's got Mark floating around?
Yeah, and to be fair,
supposedly, like, paradoxical situation.
And just to be fair, like, Papias is supposedly saying in Eusebius, we're granting Eusebius isn't making anything up along the way, that Papias says there's Mark and there's 2 Matthews. So he at least has these 3 Gospels in his possession. Why is that not enough? Well, I get what you're saying there, but it's like, I thought these were eyewitness testimonies. He obviously doesn't equate them on the same level as actual eyewitness testimonies. So I like your point here.
So it puts him in, it puts the use of Papias, it like almost raises more questions about this link between reliability and eyewitness testimony by invoking Papias, because Papias doesn't seem to think that just because you link something to an eyewitness in textual form, then it's also, that means it's reliable. He would rather have somebody who he could sort of talk to and ask questions to. So that's sort of Bauckham tweaking a traditional argument, like tweaking an argument that goes back to Papias. His wholly original argument is something from an Inclusio. So you may know this, and I'm sure some of your viewers know this, but an Inclusio is a word or phrase or image, something striking that happens at the beginning of a passage and the end of a passage, or beginning of a work and the end of a work. And they can be used for all sorts of different things. So they could be used to mark the beginning and end of a story. It can be used to like sort of note a thematic unity between them. So starting here and ending here, there's a theme to all this material in between. What Bauckham does is goes through biographies and historiographies, and he adds some in his second edition. So he adds quite a bit of evidence in his second edition of this, that sometimes in like biographies or historiography that we would think are based on eyewitness testimony, they're written close enough to the event and things like that, witnesses will be excessively named at the beginning and end of the material that came from their eyewitness testimony. So he lists a bunch of Greco-Roman examples where you have somebody that is just named for no reason. It's just like, Joe the armor bearer popped in, and you're like, who cares about Joe the armor bearer? But then Joe the armor bearer pops up again at the end of the story. And it's like, oh, because Joe the armor bearer is the one who told us this story. He uses this inclusio argument to make the argument that Peter was the testimonial source behind Mark by noticing an inclusio with Peter. So at the beginning of Mark, you have, as Jesus passed along the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and Simon's brother Andrew. So Simon is excessively named, like he's being redundant. And then at the end, in Mark 16:7, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. So again, Peter is excessively named. He doesn't need to be named there, or at least according to Bauckham. There's arguments why you would say his disciples and Peter. First of all, Peter is the leader of the disciples, so it makes sense to say the disciples and their leader. It also, when he says the disciples, we assume he doesn't mean Judas Iscariot. But we might also assume he doesn't mean Peter because Peter's last scene was denying Jesus. So it might be a clarification that, like, the disciples, and by the way, that includes Peter. Don't like throw him out. Judas Iscariot, fine, but Peter should be included. But he says, well, this excessive naming of Peter is why is one of the reasons you know that Peter was the testimonial source of Mark. He also finds an inclusio in John involving the beloved disciple. So one passage we already looked at, this is the disciple who's testifying. But at the beginning, it's a fair bit weird. So in the beginning, Andrew shows up with another disciple who's never named. And so Bauckham makes the argument that that second disciple is the beloved disciple. Well, why don't we have an indication of that? Bauckham makes the argument that we don't have an indication of that because he couldn't call him the disciple whom Jesus loved yet. So he's anonymous throughout the text, but this marker of who he is couldn't be used yet because Jesus didn't love him yet, or like he didn't have that status yet. I disagree. Because the first time we see Mary, she is called the one who anointed him. And she hasn't done that yet. But he doesn't feel bad about that. He's like, oh, well, you know Mary. I'm going to rely on your knowledge. Mary, the one who anointed him. That's who I'm talking about. We'll get to that in the next chapter. Don't worry. But this is the Mary I'm talking about, not a different Mary. And yet, so it seems like in the first chapter, having an anonymous disciple, he could have just said, the disciple whom Jesus loved or whom Jesus would love in the future. I don't know. You could indicate who he was in the narration without having it like come out through dialogue in the scene. So you have to agree with Bauckham that this anonymous disciple is not there to pair with Andrew, so you have two witnesses to what John said, which is one reason he could be there. That Andrew's who's important, but we need a second guy there as a second witness. In the literary, like, narrative sense, not in the, like, testimonial behind the gospel sense. So you have to agree with him on that. Here's my issue with Bauckham's methodology. What he wants is, if you see an inclusio like you do with Peter at the beginning and end of Mark, or like you do with a disciple at the beginning and end of John, he wants that to increase the probability that that character is the eyewitness behind all the material in between. So we can write the Gospel of John because this beloved disciple was there at the beginning, the first day that Jesus was calling disciples, and he was there at his last resurrection appearance. So he was there the whole time. He can testify to everything that happened. His apparent method, though, is to look at texts that he's confident are from an eyewitness. So based on classical scholarship, look through these biographies and historiographies, look for things that look like they were written by eyewitnesses or from eyewitnesses, and then look for an inclusio. Those two probabilities are very different. Like, those are converse statements, and they don't have the same probability. So you can't go from if A then B, and this has a certain probability, to if B then A, and assume it has the same probability, the same likelihood of telling you that information. Here's my way of highlighting this. John has a way stronger inclusio of Peter. So in the first chapter, he couldn't be more excessively named. In this passage, it's Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. By the way, he has not been renamed Peter yet, and yet the narrator feels free to call him Peter. So it seems like he could call the disciple whom Jesus loved the disciple whom Jesus loved. But okay, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, found his brother, Simon. He brought Simon to Jesus. You are Simon, son of John. You will be called Cephas, which is translated Peter. I mean, he couldn't be more excessively named in the first chapter. In the last chapter, he's not only named in a couple sentences right before the end, but we have this whole restoration scene where Jesus 3 times is like, Simon, son of John, do you love me? So we have this excessive naming of Peter in the last chapter as well. So if an inclusio points to your testimonial source, this inclusio is way stronger for Peter, and we would have to assume that Peter was the testimonial source behind the Gospel of John, not the beloved disciple, because the inclusio is so much stronger. The problem is we already used Peter for Mark, and we want to use the beloved disciple for John.
Well, you've made the case. So it's official. Peter or Peter's companion wrote Mark and John now. Everybody, great show. Dr. Tripp has proven Peter wrote.
I mean, his name is John Mark. And I'm not the first one to point that out, by the way. There was an article a few years ago that wanted to make the argument that John was written by John. But yeah, so it's he's not even using it consistently, that if you see an inclusio, that points to the testimonial source. He's deciding who he wants to be the eyewitness, and then he's looking for an inclusio, which is sort of suspect.
And I'm not trying to be rude, but this is exactly what I do, is I want to poke holes. I'm looking at scientific method of trying to see if something's false. And you do this very well in the textual sense, being a mathematician and being able to calculate and figure this stuff out. But it is something that I try not to psychoanalyze, and Christian apologists can't stand it when I do. But it's hard for me not to say you are driven. Your entire motivation is not to actually get to the answer. You're starting with, I know this is true and I'm going to prove that it's true. That's what it seems like to me. So anyway.
Yeah, I mean, he's got and I don't know, I mean, I'm not Richard Bauckham, but I don't know to what degree, he would even sort of argue with us, because it's like, I want to trust that epilogue at the end. I want to trust that it was written by this disciple. And in order for me to trust that, I need to look for the evidence that supports that. But part of critical thinking is also looking for the counter evidence. And in this case, there seems to be some pretty strong counter evidence in the gospel itself. So like, notice, I'm not looking for like random Greco-Roman texts to counter it. Like, this is in John. John itself problematizes some of his claims. So with John, the inclusio is weak on the beloved disciple. There are stronger ones, but he ignores it. We could also point out, for example, that Judas Iscariot forms a nice inclusio around the farewell discourse, but presumably Judas Iscariot is not the testimonial source for the farewell discourse. If repeated names indicate eyewitnesses, so because Peter is named excessively, he's the eyewitness. Or because the women by the cross are named excessively in the Passion narrative, there are eyewitnesses. But also repeated anonymous figures. So the fact that we're repeating this anonymous figure who we're very obscurely referring to, they also indicate eyewitnesses, then the argument's tautological. It's basically like, look for anything, because anything could be fit into this Inclusio argument. He doesn't really, to my satisfaction, take on the idea that John 21 wasn't written by the same author as John 1 through 20. I'm not saying that that's my argument. I'm not strong one way or the other on that. But if you're going to convince people, then you need to acknowledge this and give a stronger argument that John 21 was written by the same author as the rest of the gospel. Methodologically, like I said, he should look for texts with inclusios first, and then look at how many of them are eyewitness testimony, and then compare them to texts without inclusios. But instead, he looks for eyewitness testimony and then looks for an inclusio, which is the converse statement, and it's not directly relatable. And even if he's successful, so then this is an issue we'll get into no matter what. If he was super successful, if he was utterly convincing that if you put somebody at the beginning and the end of a text that tells you who your eyewitness source was, that's fakeable. The stronger the trope is, the easier it would be for somebody to fake it, to throw in an extra disciple at the beginning to imply that that's the eyewitness source, even if they weren't the eyewitness source. Even if Andrew was the only one there, I'll throw an extra guy in just so I have an inclusio. So,
and as you mentioned, I mean, you're using the inclusio argument, but like as you mentioned, and Bart Ehrman and others have pointed out, there are many Paul, am a servant of Christ or slave of Christ, and we know Paul, or we have very high confidence Paul's not writing this letter. Like, if the trope is there and they're like, people listen when you say Paul said, then if inclusio is being used here, then it would have been something that you would have wanted to put, especially Peter. I mean, Peter seems to have some clout. So
yeah, so you this is a paradox every time. And when you're talking about early Christian and early Jewish literature, where there's so much pseudepigrapha, then it's almost like the burden of proof is on anybody who wants to trust the authorship claims of the text, because there's just pseudepigrapha everywhere. And even if we're not entirely sure, so say the disputed letters, there are still defenders that the disputed letters are genuinely by Paul, but there's so much suspicion around it that you have to demonstrate to me that there's a lot of corroborating evidence, even when somebody makes a very direct claim. To say that an unnamed disciple wrote it is not the strongest claim in the world, and it also is difficult to falsify. So he's just saying the beloved disciple. Could we project onto the beloved disciple whomever we think that should be? I mean, already in modern times, it could be Lazarus, it could be Thomas, it could be Nathaniel, it could be any of these guys, and we're just sort of projecting onto them. Is that the device that he's using in the first
century? Did you see my recent Harold Attridge interview just the other day?
No.
Oh, you missed it. He's writing a commentary, a hermeneutic commentary right now on John, and I asked him who it was, and you know what he said? He thinks it's Jesus, and the reason he thinks it's Jesus that he himself is, because countless times in the Gospel of John, Jesus is his own, he comes to testify on behalf of himself. So it's over and over that Jesus is the one who testifies. And you go, well, hold on. I'm not saying there aren't other people, but like there's a lot of, if you did the counting, you'd go, hold on. Even the accusation is, the Pharisees like, hold on, you testify on behalf of yourself? So it's like, who the hell is this guy? Who is this? Is it a guy? Some say it's Mary Magdalene. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. So, I mean, the problem is exactly that he doesn't make even a strong claim. So it's difficult to falsify. And is that a strategic? There's so many books. I mean, just if I can go off on a minor digression, there's so many books in John's scholarship where they talk about this verse at the end, and they inch up so close to the idea that it's pseudepigraphal, but they don't want to cross that line, so they just like inch up to it, and they're just like, well, like the only other option is that it's pseudepigrapha, but obviously that's not the case. So like, let's go back to trusting it, and it's like, well, but you just actually made a really strong case that it's pseudepigraphal. So why back off from that? Like, follow that through a little and see where it leads. So this is everything on the claim that an eyewitness wrote John. So it's 3 chapters ish, like embedded in a much larger. There's like 20 some chapters in the book, and it hasn't really caught on. If you want to believe that John is written by an eyewitness, then it's convincing. And if you don't want to, it's not convincing. So it does have a discussion going. He got a discussion going, but I don't think he's moved anybody from one side to the other. So that's his first extension. He wants the Gospels to be linked directly to eyewitnesses as closely as possible. And in John, it's just written by an eyewitness. The other thing, though, is he wants the Gospels to be reliable. So, one, he thinks eyewitness testimony is reliable in itself, but he needs it to have survived, in John's case, over 60 years. So we need the teachings and the events to have survived well for over 60 years before John wrote this gospel. So let's grant him, for now, we can grant him that John the Elder wrote the Gospel of John. That doesn't necessarily mean that he's telling an accurate story. So we have a second extension, which is that Bauckham claims Jesus' disciples, the Jerusalem church, and a coterie of trained tradients, which includes Paul, controlled sayings material, so the teaching, more tightly than other narrative details. So when you're telling a story, like think of you're telling a joke. You can play with a lot of the details in the joke, but you need to get the punchline. And this is sort of the idea behind how the little stories about Jesus, where he has some saying embedded in it, go out. So it's like we can vary some of the details in the story, the narrative details, but we have to get the punchline right, or we can't vary that too much. And his corroborating support, which he doesn't really strongly argue, is the intertextual comparison of sayings in the Gospels, which match way better than other details in most stories. So if you look at, for example, the rejection at Nazareth in Mark and Matthew, Mark, it's a prophet is not honorless except in his homeland, among his relatives, and in his household. Matthew takes that over almost verbatim, same syntax, same grammar, everything, except he eliminates among his relatives. So we can make arguments about why that is, but it matches very closely, whereas the rest of the details sort of don't match as closely. Now, Luke has a very different story and places it very differently in his gospel, and his saying varies much more. So he alters that phrasing. So he's sort of changed everything. John doesn't even include a story. He just includes the saying, but again, very differently phrased and potentially indicating that Jerusalem is his homeland, not Galilee, not Nazareth, certainly. So Nazareth is never sort of brought up. So one critique of Bauckham that came up immediately after the first edition came out was that the data there is not as clear as he sort of assumes it is, or because he doesn't really go into the data. He just says, this is a thing, and this is why, because they controlled the sayings, and I'll explain how that might have worked. But it's not, the data intertextually is not as clear as he wants it to be, and it raises all sorts of questions that he doesn't really address. This is where my article sort of takes on Bauckham intratextually. So I look at verifiable quotation. I want to look at, are Jesus and the disciples portrayed the way that Bauckham's model requires? So if they had this strong reputation for controlling saying and replicating it verbatim to the best possible extent that they could, is that how they're depicted in the Gospels? Now, in the article, I look at all 4 Gospels and Acts, but we can focus on John. So here's an example. And I want to highlight this one. This is quoted by oppositional Jews at Tabernacles. But it sort of draws attention to how commentators react to these scenes. So Jesus says, "Amen, amen, I say to you, if anyone keeps my word, death he will never see forever." So ignore my horrible phrasing. I'm highlighting this. The Jews say, "Well, now we know you have a demon. Abraham died and the prophets, and you say, if anyone keeps my word, he will never taste death forever." So they alter his grammar, they alter his syntax, and they even substitute out one phrase for another. And Jerome Neyre's reaction to this in his commentary is that this is an example of the crowd's error concerning Jesus's words in courtroom evidence that they do not keep my words. So he really criticizes it. He says, well, he says John is really criticizing the Jews in this scene for not keeping Jesus's words. There's a problem with that claim. This is the 6th direct quotation in this conversation, and none of them have been accurate. Not one. Even when Jesus is the one doing the quoting. So there's an example earlier in this chapter. What Jesus says is, "I'm going away and you will search for me, but in your sin you will die. Where I'm going, you cannot come." The Jews ask, he's not going to kill himself, is he? Because he says, "Where I'm going, you cannot come." Now, they don't quote everything he says, but the words they quote accurately. Jesus quotes himself by saying, "I told you, you will die in your sins." So he alters the syntax, he alters the number, so in your sin becomes in your sins. "For unless you believe that I am, you will die in your sins." So nobody reacts to Jesus here and says, well, Jesus doesn't understand Jesus' sayings. They give him a pass. They trust that when he alters the wording, he's unpacking some meaning that was already in the original word. So he's clarifying what he said before, even though he's quoting himself correctly. The issue is that the Jews don't alter his wording at all. They keep it right what he said. "Where I'm going, you cannot come." For John, the issue is not, can you recite verbatim? It's not, can you remember the exact words? It's, do you understand their meaning? And however you phrase it, are you unpacking the meaning as Jesus meant it, or are you misunderstanding what he said? And this highlights it, because the Jews are portrayed as completely misunderstanding what he's trying to say, although people would highlight that, it is his mission to die. So they're not completely misunderstanding, but they're They're misunderstanding from John's perspective. And yet they replicate his exact words. Jesus presumably understands what he said, but he doesn't replicate his exact words. The issue is he doesn't seem to be acting like the sort of teacher who was training his disciples to memorize what he said and control it. He just doesn't act like this at any point in the gospel. So I put some verses at the bottom there. 151, he meets, like, second day, he meets his first disciples, and he's misquoting himself. He's altering the wording. 3:7, he's quoting himself to Nicodemus, and he alters the wording. 11:40, I'm not even sure where that came from, if it came from a previous verse, because the wording is so different from anything he said already in that chapter. So he doesn't behave like the type of person who is teaching his disciples to always control how they remember his wording. He seems to be behaving more as somebody who says, you need to understand the meaning, not memorize the words. The thing is, John's narrator also does this. So this was the passage that first drew my attention to this phenomenon. So if John's narrator is John, right? So if this is eyewitness testimony the way John used to tell it, then Jesus, after the foot washing scene, Peter's like, wash my head, wash my hands, wash everything. And Jesus says, someone who is bathed has no need to wash except the feet, but is wholly clean. And y'all are clean, but not all. So his emphasis is, dude, Peter, you're clean. I don't need to wash your whole body. We're at dinner. Let me just wash your feet and move on. But the narrator has a different motive. So he says, for he knew the one who would betray him. For this reason, he said, not all are clean. So he eliminates some words and he alters his syntax. Jesus emphasizes, by putting it at the front, emphasizes that you are clean. I just also happen to know one of you is a dick. The narrator is talking about Judas. So he emphasizes, by putting it at the front, not all are clean. Jesus totally knew that, guys. I'm protecting you from thinking he didn't know Judas was going to betray him. So he knew not all are clean. And again, this is not the only time the narrator paraphrases when he requotes. The issue from a totally literalist perspective is we only know what Jesus said through the narrator. And yet the narrator is willing to change the wording depending on his rhetorical situation. So how often has this happened elsewhere? How often, when there wasn't two phrases to compare, did he alter what Jesus said because in this moment I needed to mean this? So I just tweaked the phrasing. But either way, it doesn't seem like somebody who's strictly controlling how he relates Jesus's words. Now we can get into some examples where we would expect to see control and we don't. So in the farewell discourses, Jesus says, when the paraclete comes, he will convict the world concerning righteousness, because to the Father I go, and you no longer see me. So Jesus emphasizes that where he's going is to the Father. That's what allows him to send the paraclete. If he was just going to Massachusetts, he couldn't send the paraclete. But because he's going to the Father, he can. The disciples are upset about this. So they say, what is this he says about us? A little while and you don't see me, and a little while and you will see me. And because I go to the Father, their concern is with the fact that he wants to go, or he says he's going. His concern is with the fact that he's going to the Father. That's his whole point. So their different phrasing reflects their different concerns, and Jesus doesn't correct them. Jesus doesn't say, "What, guys, you're missing it." I said, because to the Father I go. Let's focus there. He doesn't say, you're messing up my words, even though I just said them like 7 verses ago. He instead is just like, all right, let's roll with it. Let's keep going. And that's even clearer in another example, which is really minor. But the way he originally says it is a little while and you no longer see. And again, a little while and you will see. So in the context, he's talking to his disciples. They're looking right at him. So it's not that they don't see him now. It's in a little while, you will no longer see him. And presumably this is when he dies, or this is after he's ascended to heaven. When they quote him, they make a little tweak. They say a little while and you don't see. And again, a little while and you will see. So in the little while, you simply don't. It's not that you no longer do. It's not that you used to and now you don't. It's you simply don't see. This phrasing is much more appropriate for the audience of the gospel. So for the disciples, you need to throw a no longer in there because they're looking at it. For the audience of the gospel, as John 20 says, they don't see. They don't see Jesus. So a little while and you don't see me, but we're promising a little while longer and you will see. So the promise of seeing him one day is there, but acknowledging that right now you don't. So it strikes this balance between the time of the story and the time of the audience. We also see this, I marked John 16, 14, and 15 there because we see a similar play on words in another quote right before this. Because he talks about how the paraclete will receive what is mine when he makes the original statement. So at this point, the paraclete has not yet received what is Jesus's. But when he quotes himself in the next verse, he said, for this reason I said, he receives what is mine. So the initial statement is true at the time of the story, and the quoted statement is true at the time of the audience. So he tweaks to be able to fit both time periods, sort of unite the time of the story with the time of the audience. Jesus does not correct them. Instead, Jesus adopts their phrasing. So instead of saying, no, wait, I mean, what I said was no longer. I've been telling you this all along, guys. You need to replicate my phrasing exactly. Instead, he says, okay, a little while and you don't see me. Fair enough.
Okay. I just have to throw this out there. This is going in line of the fourth wall being broken in the Gospel of John. I really think this happens a lot. Jesus is breaking the fourth wall, and you have to be a careful reader like what you're talking about here, Jeff, where you're actually seeing him pick up the phrase of the narrator in order to address the audience. So he's no longer just talking to the disciples now, using the grammatical approach that you're showing. He's talking to the people in the time period that the gospel author's writing by picking up that narrator's language.
And yeah, so or in this case, picking up the disciples' language, but by essentially establishing it one way for one purpose, to establish, like to talk to these people in the scene. But I also want this phrase to be relevant to my audience. So I'm going to tweak it a bit to make it relevant to my audience, which is the whole point behind form criticism. And I'm not a form critic, don't worry. Like I'm not saying I think form critics are right, but that was one of the pressures that they would say is why people changed the sayings of Jesus, that they made it more relevant to their audience. And here we have John making these sayings more relevant to his audience so that they could say them in their own time and they would still be true. So we don't see the control that we would expect. Now, there is one case of control. Wait, before I even get to this, though, there is, we see the same thing happen in Acts, where Peter will talk to the Jerusalem church and he'll misquote Jesus, but nobody is like, hold on a second, Peter. You should go back and think about what he actually said. He didn't say those exact words. We also see it regarding Paul talking to the Jerusalem church, where he'll misquote, at least as far as Acts narrated it or Luke narrated it. And we don't see any of the control. And for Bauckham, the Jerusalem church is supposed to be the group that really controls these saints. And yet nobody ever interrupts somebody for misquoting Jesus and like, hey, hold on, buddy. Yeah, I see what you're doing, but that's not what he actually said. There is one case of correction, which Bauckham doesn't look at, but I put it in a footnote. But I'm like, to be fair to Bauckham, there is one case of correction. And we talked about this last time. So what he says about the beloved disciple is, if I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me. Or he says about the beloved disciple to Peter. So the saying, the logos, went out among the brothers, this disciple will not die. I'm punctuating it this way because it's indistinguishable from direct quotations. It's not often punctuated this way, but there's nothing separating it from how John punctuates or marks direct quotation. So the saying went out, this disciple will not die. But Jesus didn't say he will not die, but if I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? So there is this one correction in writing, and it had to go that far. It had to go that far to people claiming that the beloved disciple is immortal for it to get a correction. And I'm not saying no beloved disciple existed, but the whole point might be that the gospel was written after he died. That's why we need to write a gospel, because our authority figure is gone. And so it could be that the claim that the disciple won't die is contradicted by the facts. So we need to correct this paraphrase. We need to get people back in line. And as you and I talked about last time, it didn't work. Even though this is in there, people told stories about an immortal John or a John ascending to heaven for centuries afterwards. So the altered version, that disciple will not die, survived well after the beloved disciple, or the Gospel of John's correction of the paraphrase. So it doesn't even make a strong argument that controlling these sayings was really easy. It seems to be that they sort of took on a life of their own.
And aren't there certain two things? Aren't there certain offshoots, we would call them, I guess you'd say, different types of Christianity religions? I think Mormonism, it might be the Jehovah's Witnesses, they think that the disciple's still alive somewhere.
Yeah, so in Mormonism, it's officially scripturalized that John the Beloved, how they refer to him, sort of wanders around America, popping into your house every once in a while to try to convert you. And there were 3 Nephites, so from the Book of Mormon, 3 Nephites who wanted the same thing. So they asked to get the same gift that John the Beloved did. So there's John and 3 Nephites walking around, and they're immortal, and they pop into your house every once in a while to try to convert you to Mormon. So the idea is that they were controlling these sayings, but here's the one case we know of where they actually made an attempt to be he didn't say that, guys, and it still didn't work. So our only evidence is that trying to control these sayings doesn't work. So again, just not a strong argument for the control.
And
one
just
thing I didn't address in the
to dumb that down, a little for people who are slow like me, what you're pretty much saying is, even if there were sayings that Jesus said, what we have that we supposedly see that Jesus is saying in these gospels, in light of the gospel showing how the methodology of memory or what they're trying to say Jesus said, they're not even consistent with that. Using that logic, how do we know what we have written in these texts that come who knows how long after the fact, even if we wanted to say someone who's an eyewitness supposedly said Jesus said this, but they're not actually saying what Jesus actually said, even evidently in their own gospel. So how reliable and trustworthy, unless you have what I like to call the Holy Spirit, like you have to make a claim of faith and you have to jump at this leap to say, magically speaking, I'm going to use magically for those who are skeptics, like, don't worry, the Holy Spirit kept everything intact. And you know what? You might as well just be honest and say, these are faith claims. I would not run around. This is the thing that kind of gets my under my skin a little, is when you run around acting like you have all this absolute, clear, obvious evidence that I'm a fool and idiot, that I don't accept that this is true. And this actually is what Jesus said. And these are actually what really happened and things like that. I think the evidence honestly is to the contrary. And it's not, I'm just dismissive. No, you need that Holy Spirit to guide you to draw these conclusions, in my opinion. That's just my thoughts. So,
and so you are relying on something that, like, unless you already believe it, it becomes a circular argument. Unless you already believe that there's some supernatural reason based in Christianity to trust the claims of Christianity, then you don't necessarily need to believe that all these things were preserved perfectly. And I think Bauckham, and, like, say, looking at Papias, is right that we need to focus on the fact that in the first century, eyewitness testimony was highly valued. On the other hand, he emphasizes this memorization and verbatim recall, and those weren't necessarily valued. Memorization and verbatim recall was step one. And then you were expected to paraphrase, you were expected to play with the language, to unpack its meaning. That's you being a good student. That's you being a good teacher, is playing with the language to unpack its meaning. So if you come to believe, for example, that Jesus was resurrected after 3 days, then it's your job to unpack any sayings that he had that point in that direction, and to rephrase them in a way that clarifies that. So it's also a different ethic on verbatim recall. There's playfulness is not looked down on. And when we look at these cases in the Gospels with verifiable quotations, they are showing that there's not this emphasis on verbatim recall, even when it's like a few minutes later or a month later or something like that. There's not this emphasis on verbatim recall. There's emphasis on proper understanding from the narrator's perspective. So as long as what you quote the person as saying is true from that perspective, then you haven't violated any sort of ethical duty as an eyewitness. So that is what I try to underline in my article, that playing with the language is exactly what you ought to do in that first century context. So then appealing to eyewitness testimony doesn't tell us anything about how accurate these sayings are, even if we granted him that it was from eyewitness testimony. He needs to do a stronger argument of that they controlled the sayings and how they controlled the sayings. And until we have a better argument on that, it's unclear how well controlled they were. Now, I've been talking about verifiable because that's what I address in the article. I want to draw your attention to unverifiable, because we're assuming. So you brought up the reason I kind of giggled when you brought up the Holy Spirit, because I mean, right now, let's say evangelicals will appeal to the Holy Spirit because the Holy Spirit is preserving the memory of these exact phrases into the text. But a lot of work has been done in recent years on the possible phenomenon of prophetism among Johannine Christians. So were they sort of giving oracles from Jesus through the paraclete in later settings and then treating those statements that came out of those later settings as genuine words of Jesus. So among the verses that they appeal to say that there might have been prophetism, you have all these passages relating to the paraclete, who will possess you, so he will be in you. He will teach you everything and remind you of all that I've said to you. So he is in some way responsible for tending to the preservation. He will testify on my behalf. Now, is he testifying only by recalling stuff, or is he testifying by telling you new stuff? It certainly would be within the power of Jesus and the Paraclete from this religious perspective to tell you new stuff. I still have many things to say to you, but you can't hear them now. So specifically, I did not say this stuff, but he will guide you into the truth. So evidently, he's going to tell you some new stuff that I was not able to tell you now. He will speak whatever he hears, so sure, he's reliable, it's coming straight from me, but it doesn't mean it's coming from the historical Jesus. And he will declare to you the things that are to come, so he will make future predictions. He will comment on where you are years later from now. So if there was any sort of prophetism where somebody would be possessed by the Holy Spirit and then declare things, then we have to worry about, when did Jesus actually say this in his lifetime? Or did Jesus say this through the Paraclete in, say, a seance? And why wouldn't we treat that as genuine? If we genuinely believe that Jesus has sent the Paraclete to possess me and declare these things to you, it would be sort of rude for me to be like, but that's not as good as what we remember him saying 20 years ago. So that could be a way to introduce sayings that have no relation to the earthly Jesus. And one of the things, we could even just focus on are the unverifiable quotations in John. So there are passages where it says, I told you, you have seen me and you did not believe, and you do not believe. When did he say that? He hasn't been quoted as saying that in the gospel, but he says he told them. So when? Is this something that came up later? An interesting one is in John 10:36. He says, because I said I am God's son. And interestingly, in Matthew, that is also an unverifiable quotation. For he said, I am God's son. In neither gospel does he say those words. But that seems very much like the sort of words you would hear in a spiritualist experience. So I just gave some other examples. I don't want to dwell on this point, but
I do want to mention this, and then I don't know how many more. By the way, how many more slides do we have?
Just a few more.
Okay. So just something interesting on that, he never says that. It might fit the idea that this is why the post hoc explanation for the death of Jesus, and people are experiencing him after in some way, whatever this prophetess type situation is, might explain why they're putting the words in his mouth. And you don't hear him saying this earlier in Mark and things like that. He's trying to hide it. Or at least they're seemingly making him look like this is why y'all never heard him say it, because he didn't want to make this clear. I don't know. There's just a lot of guesses that you could make on this, but anyway.
Yeah, and it raises another sort of an issue that has to be addressed. And the problem is, in the way I view it, Bauckham is, again, he's adopting the sort of form critical assumption, which is not a form critical assumption, it's a general assumption a lot of people have, that if it's positioned as eyewitness testimony, then it's got to be reliable and accurate. In the article, I highlighted how culturally that wasn't necessarily the case from a literary and sort of just even testimonial point. But we also have to appreciate that they came from a very different culture, and they may have experienced their religion very differently than, say, modern evangelicals do.
Mm-hmm.
And so they might have seen it as perfectly valid to say, well, one of the prophets in our church said Jesus said this, so we should read it back into his life in some way, because obviously we have to trust the paraclete. It would be unfaithful of us to not trust the words that Jesus sent us.
I think it's funny too, just to make a funny note, where there's a parable. I can't remember if it's Matthew or Luke, where Jesus is telling this parable. And the whole context of the parable is to explain why he's not come back yet. So like it's like Jesus is already trying to tell you a story about how he really isn't trying to tarry, but like just keep waiting and stuff. And it's like, hold on, man. Like you're making up this story, putting it in the mouth of Jesus as if he's telling this parable about why he's delaying his coming, when he's saying, I'm not going to delay in all these other places. So there's just so many red flags, Jeff, to be skeptical. Anyway.
Yeah, and as big a book as Jesus and the eyewitnesses is, you can't take on all these arguments. So there's still some development needed. The last one, is that even if they controlled the sayings, we have to assume that they remember them accurately. And so he extends it in another way to say that, well, Jesus's disciples trained to memorize his teachings during his lifetime, even in the case of, say, Matthew, writing them in notebooks. So these memories could remain stable over the decades between the events and passing them on to other trade-ins or to the evangelists. And he does a great job. He has a great chapter on memory studies, where he presents a lot of comparison of the sorts of things people remember and the sorts of details that harmonize well in the stories about Jesus. So it's sort of making the argument that this is exactly the sort of stuff you would remember. And he also brings up some ancient and modern feats of memory. His ancient, he doesn't rely on that so much. He sort of refers to other people that bring that up. So you could think about, like, the rabbis' students who could memorize, whole lists of the law and who commented on them. He also talks about a modern guy who, in 1973, told a story about something that happened in 1910, but there was a newspaper article about that event. And you can compare what he said in 1973 to what actually was recorded in 1910 and see where they're similar and different. So he gets some stuff wrong, but like a lot of it remained intact. So he's making the argument that they could have remembered these facts genuinely over the years, and then when they got to a point where they needed to start controlling the scenes, they would have been controlling them accurately. Judith Redman wrote an article in JBL highlighting some of the weaknesses here, which effectively underlined that Bauckham is maybe a bit overly optimistic about human memory in general. So she highlights places where memory is weak. So people fill in gaps in memory through schema or guesses. So her example there is, like, if I said, what happened to you yesterday morning, you would probably draw on genuine memories of yesterday morning. If I said, what happened to you last Wednesday morning, then you're going to fill in gaps by stuff that's normal for a Wednesday morning. So this is probably what often happened with stories about Jesus, that, like, this is what normally happened. So if we need to fill in any details, we can fill them. People can be influenced by shared narratives of an event, especially by people who narrate past events with confidence, even when the confident people make mistakes. So if Peter misremembers something, again, this issue, if Peter misremembers something, and like Thomas is sitting off to the side and is like, that's not the way I remember it happening, But like Peter's really confident. So, okay, I'll just go with Peter's version. She talks about the freezing effect. So people establish stable forms of a story, complete with inaccuracies. So about 30% of the content might be distorted, about 70% of the wording, even when they can recheck the written account. So if you ask me to memorize a story, like read it and memorize details and try to tell it back to you, I will very quickly, after a few retellings, get about 30% of the content wrong. I'll get about 70% of the wording wrong, but I'll get a stable form. I will start telling you that story the same way every time, even if you're like, here's the story, are you sure? Like, even if I fact check you, I'll be like, no, I got it. I know how to do this. People are not very good at remembering previously held attitudes and beliefs when they come to a new position. So this is something I want to focus on, because the influence of post-resurrection experience would make it difficult to remember their attitudes before the resurrection. And flashbulb memories, so memories of important events, form and are set within about a week of the event, shaped in part from individual memory along with the influence of others. And flashbulb memories can be false. So interestingly, Bauckham gives his own example of this. He gives an example Mark Twain told, where he distinctly remembered a story about his little brother walking into a fire. And yet, that couldn't have been the case, because the time that he remembers his brother walking into the fire, he was 1 week old. He wouldn't have been walking into a fire yet. He wasn't able to walk yet. So he knows it's false just through logic and through records. But he also has this distinct memory of his brother walking into a fire. And yet on the next page, Bauckham says, memories for unusual events are the least likely to be false memories. Well, you just gave us an example of one. Like, that would be pretty memorable, watching your brother walk into a fire. But it's a false memory. And it wasn't even spurred on by anything. It wasn't like somebody implanted the memory. It just has a false memory. The reason I wanted to bring these two up last is things like this. So Jesus says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up in John. And then we get this note from the narrator. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. That's at least 2 years before Jesus died in the Gospel of John. So their memory of this event would have become stabilized within a week or two. And then you have a big event later that makes you reinterpret it. So which one wins? The stable memory or the new interpretation? I bring up the examples from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, or Matthew, Mark, and Acts, because they each have different interpretations of the same. In all of the other cases, they say it's false testimony. So it's people lying about what Jesus said. And yet John is reporting it as actual things that he said. Of course, he reinterprets it and says, well, the 3 days tells me it was really about his body. But he keeps the same. So you have this tension between them. So if we granted Bauckham's hypothesis that this is eyewitness testimony, we seem to have very different memories of this event. Not to mention the fact that, Jesus is overturning the tables in John happens 2 years before it does in the Synoptics and all that. And he quotes different scripture and blah, blah, blah. But they seem to be remembering it. So even if we grant every other hypothesis, they seem to be remembering it very differently. So the disciples did not, according to the eyewitness testimony they left behind in the Gospels, granting his hypothesis. They didn't do the long necessary training to counter these negative effects on their memory. Yes, you can cite big feats of memory, but that often takes practice. And they were with Jesus on and off for under 1 year in the Synoptics and around 2 years in John. So at best, I put a picture of some college sophomores. At best, we have a couple of college sophomores who went to school off and on for 2 years, and then we're expecting them to remember precisely everything that happened in their 2 years at college. These were everyday guys. They weren't the sharpest tacks in the drawer. They were chosen because they were willing to follow Jesus. They weren't chosen because they're great memorization skills, at least according to the Gospels. So either the Gospels do represent how the disciples characterized themselves and they're full of crap, or they don't reflect how the Gospels, or they don't reflect how the disciples remembered themselves, but then they're not eyewitness testimony. So again, we get into this paradoxical situation. If you push too hard this way, you end up pushing yourself over here. So just to end, I'll try to be quick here. He does highlight, these are some examples from other Gospels. He does highlight some examples where he thinks it's pointing to memorization. So when Jesus says, let these words sink into your ears, he argues that that's, please memorize this. And it says, the Son of Man is going to be given over into people's hands. Then at the end of Luke, it says, remember how he spoke to you. And they remembered his words, but those words don't match very well. This is only a couple months later, and the Son of Man is going to be given over into people's hands becomes he must be given over into people who are sinners' hands. So we add a qualification in light of the crucifixion. We now can't just be neutral here. They are sinners and be crucified and the third day rise. So we get this addition that's either being brought in from other sayings, or it's corrupting the saying as it stands anyway, and nobody corrects anybody. So the two figures at the tomb say this, who I think Bauckham correctly says are angels, but there's also two of them because they're witnesses, and yet the women at the tomb aren't like, well, that's not actually what he said. We also have like the crow for Peter, and none of them match precisely. So Peter remembers his words a few hours later, but none of them match precisely. Two I want to highlight. Mark just changes the word order a bit. So he eliminates some stuff at the beginning, and then he changes the word order a bit. I obnoxiously said twice and thrice because it rhymes. So dis and tris. Now, rhyme helps you to stabilize wording. But according to this, it's not actually the way he said it. So, yes, rhyme stable memorization is not necessarily accurate memorization. A rhyme would help you remember the phrase, but the way that Mark depicts it, it's not actually what he said. So again, this is just Mark's portrayal. I'm not saying this is a dictation of what was actually spoken. If you look at Luke, it's completely different. Like he muddles it all up. And again, this is only a few hours later. The only issue here is Bauckham's appeal to Luke as somebody who really values memorization and portrays the disciples as memorizing Jesus's words. Evidently, Peter wasn't the strongest one at that. So in my paper, I looked at how well the disciples quote Jesus versus how well others quote Jesus. So the disciples as potential eyewitnesses versus other people that wouldn't be eyewitnesses. They're a little better. They only paraphrase around 82% of the time, whereas other people paraphrase 91% of the time. But it's not a significant difference. And more importantly for me, Jesus is not an influential variable. So if it's Jesus talking, their accuracy only goes up to 19 as opposed to 7. That's not a significant shift. And Jesus isn't an important variable for non-followers. So everybody seems to just paraphrase at about the same rate. If you look at the accurate ones, they're very short. It's easy to quote somebody verbatim when all they said was, I am. But it's different when you have a whole long phrase. So Jesus is not portrayed as an influential variable on them. And they are the worst at adding. They add to his words way more than non-followers. So if you look at followers, they're adding around 25% of the time. And it might be something simple, like in Acts 22:8, he adds, I am Jesus the Nazarene, because it happens to be relevant to his audience right now. Paul has just gotten through completing a Nazarite vow, and he's talking to a Jewish audience. So he adds the Nazarene there. When later he's talking to a Roman governor, he doesn't add the Nazarene. The Nazarene has no meaning for a Roman governor. What he does add is a line from Euripides. He says, well, it's hard on you to kick against the goads. The Roman governor is going to recognize that, but he quotes Jesus as saint because he's got a new audience. He's got a new context. He's going to alter what Jesus said of it. So this was exactly what form critics were accusing the early church of, is adding to Jesus's words, and their portrayal in the Gospels and Acts lends some support to that they felt much more comfortable adding to his words than other people did. So his main thesis, I think, is strong. His sub-thesis that the Gospels were heavily influenced by the oral storytelling of the eyewitnesses builds hypothesis on top of a hypothesis. There's little firm contemporary support. It effectively adopts the telephone model. It just shortens the cord. So he trusts eyewitnesses. He just wants less of a gap between the eyewitnesses and the text. But just because that's your motive doesn't mean it makes it the case. Bauckham's sub-thesis that eyewitnesses and trade-ins could have formally controlled sayings is under-argued in his book, although it has been developed by other people. So, I mean, one criticism I put in my article is if he just put a could have, 90% of the time he would have had solid statements, but instead he puts things like certainly. And his sub-thesis that eyewitnesses trained to memorize sayings and recall them verbatim is just overly optimistic about memory. And my last point that I want to make before we turn to Q&A is Bauckham ends by sort of expressing some frustration that we don't trust the Gospels as much as we trust other Greco-Roman literature. And this is also a frustration voiced by like Craig Keener and Christobiography, that we should trust these things as much as we trust other literature of the time. We don't question every little detail of Plutarch's lives. Why are we questioning every little detail of the Gospels? The response I would have is that Christians raise the stakes of that trust by orders of magnitude. If Plutarch is a little wrong about Nero, who cares? It's not going to change my day. But if the Gospels are a little wrong about Jesus, that changes billions of people's lives. And so because the stakes are so high, and because especially among like evangelical circles with their historicist attitude to the Gospels, then we need to be really sure about what the Gospels say, and we have a responsibility to point out when they're not as certain as some people are making them out. So I hate to play a, like chicken and egg argument against them at the end, but the issue is not just distrust for distrust's sake. It's the stakes have been ramped up so high that then scholars in these fields have an obligation to test every hypothesis and to highlight when there's doubt.
Wow. That was a lot. There's so much good stuff here. I need to tease everybody because your memory part on Bauckham at the end was golden. Specifically, let me show this here. I actually promoted this course before for those who didn't know the unknown gospels, right? He goes to talk about why Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, like, he's obviously trying to highlight the issue. Did they really even write these gospels and stuff like that? And in this course, I edit all the courses for Bart. I just give everybody like the inside scoop. I do all the editing. And when I edited this course, Bart was in this whole lesson. I think this is lesson 8. Let me double check here. It doesn't tell you on here, but I have it in his on the video here. It is lesson 4. Sorry, it's the lecture 4. In lecture 4, and Bart Ehrman's recording, he's giving memory studies because he did like an extensive 2 years. He said, I didn't read anything. I didn't read gospels. I didn't read like anything but memory studies and the science behind what's going on. And he wrote a specific book on this relating it to the gospels. And long story short, he was trying to give the credentials or statistics that the day after 9/11, when 9/11 hit, we all felt that. If you were born, you may even have felt it after you were, born. Your parents kind of relayed how serious this was, or it impacted you somehow. I mean, everybody practically in the world felt that. And he was telling about these college students. I can't remember what college. He gives all that in the course. And he's saying how 70-something of these students took this questionnaire. It was like a 10 or 7 questionnaire. And they all filled it out. And in 2 years from then, these students who took it, I think, were freshmen. Most of them were in the college, if not all of them. They retook the same exact identical questionnaire. And then they did the math. And this is something you would love. I got to get this to you because you're a mathematician. Like math like unbelievably well. And it was shocking to find out how many got every question wrong. Like all 7 or 10 of them. And they just did this 2 years ago, but it was post-trauma, post-crucified Savior, post your Messiah, your guy gets crucified, you're on the run for your life, whatever, just painting the picture here. And it's only 2 years later. And so many of them got all of them wrong. Almost everybody but 2 out of 70-something people, 2 people got all 7 or all 10 of the questions correct. That means 70-something of the whole total, almost all of them got at least 1 or 2 of them wrong. And so it was just looking at the numbers made me go, I mean, and these are college trained like students who are not fishermen out here on a lake who somehow are catching fish just to be able to save their family and keep food coming in on the table. Like they're academically trained. And like you said, if the Gospels are accurate in what the disciples were, the odds are, you're not dealing with academics. You're not dealing with people who are out here who have this education and stuff. So, anywho, did you want to make a quick comment on that, and then we can get to super chats?
Yeah, I mean, just so you create a sort of curve of how well they respond, and again, this is a different group in a different context, but they're hearing interpretations of the event after the fact. So what did they know at the time? What did they know later? And how does their information they got later influence how they remember the original? And which might have been the reason for some of the wrong answers, because this later authoritative narrative that they got from news sources, from their parents, from whomever, is influencing how they remember their original experience. So you have this like curve of how well they can do, and the issue is, how certain or how likely are all of ours to be on the upper end of that curve? One, well, like you said, they're fishermen. They're probably not all on the upper end. There's probably more likely lumped toward the lower end of that memory curve. And then on top of that, like, if they have authority, if they are the authoritative people, then who's going to question them? Like, are they might stabilize into one way of thinking about that event, and it's factually errant, but are you going to question Peter? Like, are you going to say, well, I mean, that's not what, like, you know, some schmo I met on the street said. Like, you're going to grant them the authority. And so that, you know, all those things have to come into play. There was another issue that came up while I was reviewing Keener's Christo biography, which makes this like argument about the Gospels as biographies, so they're reliable because they're written within living memory. And just my question was like, has this guy never had a bad student? Like, I've had students where they just can't memorize for squat. Like, it doesn't matter. You can review and review and review with them, and they come in and they're like, oh, I forgot. And it's like, yeah, like, so none of them are that, you know, like any sort of faulty memory is going to introduce distortion in. And it's really unlikely that none of them have it, people.
And if you factor in like that example of the memory that Bart was bringing up, post-trauma, so it's a whole different category than just memory, with post-traumatic situations and memory, and trying to somehow factor in, like, your memory isn't going to be distorted from that situation, which is why almost every student didn't even remember. There was a question in the questionnaire, pre-taking that question, was, do you remember taking this test? And they're like, no, they don't even remember taking the test post-trauma. Now, this is why you have to bring in that kind of magical thinking. Well, you have the Holy Spirit, the paraclete guided them to remember or whatnot. And that's an assumption. You have to bring that assumption before you get into it. When all of the stuff you described today makes me see, wow, looks like men, looks like people, looks like, you know, typical writers. You would compare this to other literature and you'd say, hey, I'm reading this the same way I'm reading that. But if you bring in that assumption, you'll get somewhere. Stop Scamming Man says, how high is John's Christology, giving that his Jesus running away from crowds?
So Jesus runs away from crowds. Jesus also sort of disappears from within the middle of crowds. So his Jesus is untouchable. In a different article, I sort of highlighted how John's Jesus has an agenda, and he needs to die at the right time, in the right way, in the right place. In a way, he sort of picks fights with people because he needs to ensure that certain people don't believe in him and certain people are hostile to him, or he's not going to die. Like, if the Sanhedrin or if Pilate love him and they believe in him like the disciples do, then they're not going to execute him. So John's way of playing this is not like, so Mark has this sort of hidden Messiah motif. John is like blatantly obvious he's the Messiah, but he also manipulates situations where he sort of ramps up the tension. So if you look at John 7 and 8, he ramps up the tension and then he skedaddles. And it's like, oh, okay, so these people are nice and angry with me. And every time he goes to Jerusalem, he's sort of ramping up the tension. That way, when he shows up for his hour, which is preset, it's already mentioned in John 2, when he shows up for it, like, things are in place that will happen. I guess the counter question would be, like, couldn't he call down angels to destroy everybody, or couldn't he just be like, everybody shut up and freeze, and like Professor X them into obedience? Sure, he could,
Right.
But that's not his agenda. His agenda is to ramp up that tension. And it's just like, Matthew acknowledges at the crucifixion. During his passion narrative, Matthew has his Jesus feel like, I could call down legions of angels, but I'm not gonna, because he needs to die. So there's the risk, if you start pulling moves like that. And this is just me looking at it as literature, not looking at it as a record of historical events. But there's a risk if you have Jesus pulling moves like that like people start believing it. So he needs certain people to not believe in him before the crucifixion. Like, I think John thinks everybody should believe after the resurrection. But before the crucifixion, he makes a very strong point about, like, I call some people, I don't call everyone. And that's about, like, him engineering so that he dies at his hour.
I like how you described this, because when I wrote my article on what I call the minimal doubts argument, because I'm actually combating sometimes is minimal facts. Here's some minimal facts that apologists will argue to try and like prove that there's good reason to believe Jesus rose from the dead. And I'm like, let's look at the doubting traditions and let's look at the problems. And one of the things I mentioned was in Mark, our earliest gospel, we find this indicator that they want signs. And we carry this assumption because we already see the bad guys as, well, the Jewish leaders, at least in Mark. And in this, we assume that when they're asking for signs, they're being insincere. And in my article, I said, why do we bring that assumption? What if they really are sincere and curious, but Jesus says, thank you, Father. Like, he thanks God that he did not reveal this to them so that they did not believe and repent and turn. He's happy that people don't repent. So this mechanism you're describing here on ensuring he dies is a narrative trope. It looks like a ploy to actually ensure he gets crucified by these people.
I mean, so for a long time, and I've never written it, but for a long time, I was thinking of writing an article essentially making the argument that John portrays him as a suicide by cop. And that's what's going on in John 8 when they say, like, is he going to kill himself? Because he says, where I'm going, you can't come. Mm-hmm. The previous one is he going to go to the diaspora of the Greeks and teach them? And
right.
The ironic truth there is that no, but he will be present in his disciples who do that. And so if there's an ironic truth to the idea that he killed himself, like that could be John heading off certain criticisms of his depiction of Jesus. And so looking at this sort of history of interpretation of Jesus's death as suicide, and this sort of pops up from time to time in believers and in non-believers. So looking at that, and yeah, I think that's John's version of the hidden Messiah motif, that it's, no, I'm pretty clear about who I am. Like, he's pretty blatant about it. But I know some people aren't going to believe. And so when they ask me a straightforward question, like, can you give us some signs? And we were like, no, I can't give you a sign. I'm going to make some obscure statement about the sanctuary that you're obviously going to misunderstand, because the sanctuary is right over there, but I'm going to mean it referring to my body, even though not that building right there. And then 5 verses later, he's doing signs. It's like, well, why didn't you just do the signs right there?
Right.
But it's because he needs those Jerusalem authorities to not like him.
Oh, well put. Stop Scamming Man, thank you for the super chat. Stop Scamming Man again. Who was this disciple Jesus loved the most? And are we meant to believe he would still be alive at the second coming?
I think so. Who he is, there's a lot of theories. So I think if you're going to make an argument, Bauckham's argument, like that, you can tie him stronger to John the Elder than you can to John the son of Zebedee, is fair. I think you could make a stronger argument for John the Elder than John the son of Zebedee, but there's also been arguments for Thomas, arguments for Lazarus, or there have been arguments that it's that the beloved disciple is a narrative trope, that he's simply the idealized disciple. So he's anonymous, so you can project yourself onto
Right.
him.
I like that idea, by the way. When I read this, that's kind of my assumption, but
yeah. So who he is, I don't know. I mean, he was deliberately left anonymous. I'm not going to fight with him, but I think the text takes a strong tact that no, that wasn't my point, that he would still be alive at the second coming. I think the text goes out of its way in a way that's unusual to say, my point was, Peter, you're going to be martyred. If I wanted to go the complete 180 of you being martyred and say, this guy's going to be immortal, it doesn't matter. You follow me. I was martyred. You're going to be martyred too. So you do what I tell you to do. Don't worry about him. So I think it's hyperbolic. I think the whole point is like, if I wanted to go the complete opposite with this guy, who cares? That's none of your concern. You listen to me on what is going to happen to you. Now, could it have been that, say, John the Elder was alive well into the first century? So could it be that they thought, like, the second coming shouldn't come before he dies? So maybe even taking Mark into account. So Mark 9, where it's like, there is some alive today who will be here. So are we waiting? There's still a guy alive. So the end could still come any day. But once the beloved disciple dies, assuming he was a real person, then it's like, no, okay, this is a mistake. Like, it was good speculation, but it's countered by the facts. It's sort of like when late great planet Earth claimed that, the end would come in 1988 and it would be the Soviet Union riding into Iraq or whatever. That was a great idea to like play with until 1988 came and it didn't happen. Okay, we let it go and we move on.
Wonderfully put. I think I go with that idea that John knows earlier synoptics, and this author, and I do think 21 is added, even though, I mean, I'm not like dogmatic, but it looks like there's an ending in 20 and then you got to have a second ending. So it sounds like there's a tack on. And yesterday, Shelley Matthews was talking to me about Luke Acts, and she's written commentary, a feminist commentary specifically dealing with Acts and seeing the sensitivities of things that really are interesting. She points out, like, a lot of, when you want to fudge stuff, it's usually the beginning or ending of text that you do it at. And here you want to do it at the end. But 21 talking about the end or the coming of Jesus and stuff. The way I read that was like, everybody's dead. Everybody that matters is dead. They're projecting it back into the lifetime and saying, there's a rumor around that one of them wouldn't die. Jesus was going to come back, and then they put into Jesus' mouth this idea like, look, I said, if it be my will, like chill, guys. I didn't say like it will happen. I said, like, if I want, I can do anything I want. And I said, if. I never said he would never die. But you see, like, the bold earlier gospels making a claim like, some of you standing here will not taste death until the Son of Man comes. And Paula Fredrickson told me in person, which you gotta stay tuned for the episodes that I got on my Patreon, or join the Patreon. You can access it right now. The first one's already up. I'm editing the second. She says that Mark's doing a 2-generation thing, just like Moses and Joshua. The wilderness generation has to die. The promised land, the next generation is one that's going to see it, because Mark, she says, is written later. Paul's already late to the party. She said, so Mark is really late. So Mark invents a 2-generation model. And it's just really interesting, fun things to like explore and get into. But I think that's something going on. I don't know. Thank you. Stop Scamming Man. In John and elsewhere, there's difficulty recognizing Jesus after his resurrection. Could this come from people claiming to be Jesus after he died? Like Nero. Remember the fake Nero that ran around and everybody thought it was Nero, but it was an imposter?
Yeah, I like the idea of like Thomas throwing on a fake beard, just running around. It's like they call me the twin, man. The religious, the sort of within their cultural position that they take is that this idea of a polymorphic Jesus that so with really high Christology, that his physical form is not stable, it's open to different perceptions and things like that. So in other literature, say when the three magi visit Jesus and see him in the tent with Mary, they each go in one after the other. And when the old man goes in, he sees an old man with Mary. When the middle-aged man goes in, he sees a middle-aged man. When the young man goes in, he sees a young man. And then only when all three of them go in do they see a baby. So there's this sort of idea in early Christianity of his divinity implying that he could have a sort of unstable physical form. It could come out of the idea that, like, even out of the Transfiguration, where you have somebody who is divine and so just doesn't look the same. So during the Transfiguration, like, he just doesn't look the same. When he reveals his divinity, he's not like same old Jesus. So, and when John in Revelation sees him, he doesn't see same old Jesus. He sees something else. And he recognizes that it's Jesus, but he's not seeing a mirror image of Jesus.
Are these epiphany stories, you would say?
In some cases, yeah. Like, and they come out of a more, like, not totally Gnostic, but Gnostic leaning, like proto-Gnostic. So they're leaning in that direction where it's a really high Christology, sometimes even adoptionistic, so that the Christ is one thing and Jesus is another. So that, like, when you're seeing the Christ is divorced from Jesus, then he can take on whatever form he wants. I think within the context of early Christianity, the way they understood it is through that lens, that, like, you had such a powerful perception of this person's divinity that nailing them down to a single physical form could be difficult. We see that in John in the Mary Magdalene story, where she doesn't recognize the gardener until he speaks. And he says her name. So the issue could just be that he wants to put emphasis on the voice. That you understand who Jesus is, not by looking at him, but through his words, which again is a verse that's brought up in Prophetism, like in arguments for Johannine Prophetism. That, if I'm channeling the paraclete, I'm giving you Jesus' words, but I don't look like Jesus. So you don't recognize Jesus by looking at me. I'm just the gardener. You recognize Jesus by the words that I speak, like through my prophetic gift. So that's a verse that some people who support the idea of prophetism in the Johannine community, that scene with Mary Magdalene could be pointing in that direction.
I do think it's a interesting thing with what you're saying about the paraclete, the fact that there are the sayings of "this is my body," and it's repeated. That continued tradition is repeated of speaking the words Jesus said at the Eucharist, if you will. And I do think that Luke story is kind of pointing at this whole Lord's Supper, if you will, Eucharist image. He breaks the bread, then they recognize him. So maybe it's not just words, but actions and words. I don't know. Anyway, stop scamming, man. Would wine and vinegar have been a normal drink for them?
It is. Sometimes you just have shitty wine. So, like, sometimes it starts to spoil. And, like, these aren't rich guys. They're soldiers sitting around. So it could be. Vinegar is a bit of a stimulant, and you are trying to torture. the person on the cross. So having some vinegar mixed with wine, so having it because it's vinegar, but we'll mix a little wine in so it's, you can actually put it down, you don't throw it up, to stimulate somebody, so that they don't, because the whole issue with crucifixion is you asphyxiate because you get worn out and you're in pain. So you're sort of out like this, and as you like wear out, your diaphragm has pressure on it, and you choke. So that's how you die. Well, if I give you a little hit of Coke, then all of a sudden you're like, whoa, I'm up. And,
yeah.
And so on a minor level, that might be what the vinegar is doing. Sort of, whoa, okay, I'm back. And that means you survive longer and you're under more torture. So it might be a reason some guards would have vinegar mixed with wine on hand. There's also just the issue that pointing to the vinegar could be a way of invoking the Psalms. So Psalm 22 in particular comes up a lot. Psalm 69 and Passion in the Passion narrative. So it could be that they gave him wine just because, like, you don't want him to die of thirst. So we're gonna give him wine, but we need to somehow emphasize the suffering, and we need to emphasize the connection to this scriptural passage. So we'll throw in the idea that it's also mixed with.
Yeah, that could be theological. Yeah. MPL Cindy, thank you for the super chat. How would the dating of the gospel relate to the likelihood of John the elder of John being the disciple, or is as the author? Sorry, elder of John. John
so
the elder.
If we keep, because Bauckham doesn't question the dating, so he's not recently there's been a trend to like try to push the gospels earlier, but Bauckham is not part of that. He still says, sometime in the 90s. Jesus dies around 30. So let's say I'm 15. Then in 30, then by 95, I'm 80. So I could still be alive. If I'm well off, generally a pretty healthy guy, wasn't killed, I could still be alive. So, and be like around 80. Were there a ton of people around 80? No. But that could also be like why people were commenting on how long this guy lived, is because, wow, he's really old. So John the Elder's in the window. Like, he could have lived that long if he were young. And there's some connection, like, if we get into all the speculation, it could be that John the Elder is the young man who's running around in his underwear with Jesus in Mark. So you can speculate all over the place.
Yeah.
But it's not impossible that a disciple of Jesus could still be alive in the 90s, and so that John is still later than all the other gospels, but written by an eyewitness. So it's just a matter of probabilities. Like, the farther you push it, the rougher it gets. Bauckham tends to trust this because of early comments on the Gospel of John, that it was written, I think, in the reign of Trajan. So he wants to keep the dating because that way he can trust the early patristic evidence.
Got it. Thank you so much for that super chat. Gray's 174. What exactly is the thought process behind writing pseudepigrapha? I gather it's more nuanced than, all right, time to start lying to everybody.
To an extent, like, I think it starts early with, if you look at, scholars will talk about, say, in the book of Isaiah, you'll see distinctions between first Isaiah and second Isaiah and even third Isaiah. But you don't see first and second Isaiah in your table of contents. It's just Isaiah. Mm-hmm. So they still distinguish between this early material that looks like it genuinely came from Isaiah and this later material that looks like it was added on. So the language changes, the themes change, the concerns change. So they think, well, this was added on by his disciples. So I think it starts there. Just if I'm in the school of of these people, then I can write with authority in their name. By the time you get to like Daniel, it's to serve an apocalyptic fiction. So Daniel is probably not written by Daniel, but you give it this ancient person so that his predictions look impressive. It's like, wow, all the predictions that came true up to this moment came true. All these other predictions. So what he's saying will happen now is something we should listen to. And by the time you get to the first century, it's sort of, it's that, but it's also just authority. I mean, like you mentioned, Derek, I'll listen to Paul. I might not listen to Paul's friend Steve. Mm-hmm. So, if I sign a letter, Paul's friend Steve, like, it might not have that same authority. One thing that has really come out in gospel scholarship lately is sort of the competition. Like, why bother writing another one? And especially among the synoptics, it just seems silly. It's like, they're so similar. Like, why keep writing them? And one is competition to say, I'm going to correct the impression, maybe not correct the facts all the time, but I'm going to correct the portrait of Jesus that you're giving, or I'm going to correct the portrait of the disciples that you're giving. And so then you need to have the authority to do that. If Mark is, say, already attached to Mark, and so in some way, even if it's true or not, like if Mark is already attached to Peter, like a friend of Peter's, then I need to maybe step it up to claim that I have more authority. And the beloved disciple is like, there's a strong through line of getting him to be authoritative.
And better than Peter. He beats Peter to the grave or to the tomb. He's
laying in Jesus's lap, just like Jesus lays in God's lap. He recognizes who's on the shore in John 21. Peter doesn't. So he follows Jesus all the way to the cross. Peter doesn't. So even if you're constructing a fictional character, it's like a lot of effort is put into this guy being better than Peter and being more authoritative than Peter. Since Mark is the previous gospel that most people are most likely to connect John to, that he knows, it's the safest one. Then if Mark is already sort of being attached to Peter in some way, then out-competing Peter would be important. But making a strong claim and saying, Andrew wrote this. Okay. Does anybody know Andrew? Did Andrew say that? Did Andrew say he was working on a gospel? So if we create an anonymous figure, then it's not a falsifiable claim. You can project onto this figure whoever you want.
And this is reason why they would want to make sure that they put the names to who these, and make sure this person wrote this gospel and try to connect them to the direct apostles somehow to Jesus, because authority in some way. Thank you so much. Gray's 174. Did the author think the bodily resurrection appearances literally happened in the way he wrote them? If not, what was he thinking when he did?
I mean, now we're psychologizing the author, which is always dangerous. I mean, there was a previous question about John the Elder, and there's a great strain of German scholarship from the beginning of the 20th century that takes seriously these ideas that John is really old when he writes the gospel, and then tries to psychologize him as an old man going senile. So they try to psychoanalyze him, and it's not the best scholarship, but so then we're getting into risky territory. It's difficult to say because, for example, Thomas never pokes the holes, we never see him poke the holes. He's invited to, but we never see him actually do it. So, is he bodily? Like Luke seems to go out of his way to have him eating and stuff, and he's seriously bodily. But John sort of moves in that direction, but John could also be taking on other beliefs. So even if John thinks of him as bodily, there is a sort of belief in zombies in the old ancient world. We would call them revenants, but there is a sort of belief in zombies. So some of the attention to Jesus's body could be he's not a ghost and he's not a revenant. So he's not a zombie or a ghost. Like whatever's going on here, he's not one of those two things. I see no reason not to believe, though, that whoever wrote it genuinely thought that a physical person showed up. What they want you to think, though, is that he's living. So he shows up in a perfect living body rather than a undead body or as a ghost.
Thank you so much. Grays also says, thoughts on legitimacy of undesigned coincidences. Have you heard of this?
I've heard a little bit about it.
Do you have any criticisms or thoughts on it? And I'd love to do a deep dive with you on this, because there's something I have to tell our audience about you. And maybe I have to pay you for your time, but that's okay. It's worth it because you pay attention to detail very carefully, and I appreciate that. You get down into, and people have been coining it. Derek loves using the term pericope now. Yeah, I do. But getting down into the text, comparing the text, even within the gospel or synoptically or among all four gospels and the literature we have, you're very careful about that. So anyway, undesigned coincidences, and maybe you and me can talk about doing something.
So this is sort of, if I'm remembering correctly, it's sort of, it's in the springtime, like a story happens in springtime in one, and there's green grass in the other. That sort of,
like nobody consciously thought about it. It just was historically factual, because you'd have green grass and one mentions spring and they go together, but they're not, like, he doesn't say spring and this one doesn't say green grass. So there's this undesigned overlap that it's like, duh, this is because this really happened in springtime, like historically.
The triggering word for me is coincidence. So if you have coincidences, you then have to test whether they're significant. So based on your model for how these were composed, how unlikely is it to have these sorts of details in there on other grounds other than this really happened? I imagine there are more than a few where it may be a literary trope. The thing may be symbolic. And so, of course, like two different people went to the same place. They're drawing on similar scripture. So, say like we talk about the question about the vinegar. If they're both drawing on the Psalms, then they might both come up with that image. And because they're reminded of it, say with the splitting of the clothes or something like that. And then there's just the issue of have you ruled out influence, like direct influence? So if Mark says one thing and Matthew says another thing, Matthew seems pretty clearly to know Mark. And so does he take Mark's green grass and alter it to springtime or something like that? Does he take a detail and simply paraphrase it?
This is a big issue.
Ruled out that John knows Mark. So if he's putting it, say, just before Passover, so this reminds me of the 5,000, because in John it's just before Passover. So that would be around the right time for having some green grass, I guess. But the issue is, one, is that a coincidence? Because it's just a coincidence, because John ties a bunch of his stuff to to festivals on the Jewish calendar. And as I argue in an article on Jesus' special knowledge in John, there's hidden special knowledge at the end of that story. And all of the hidden special knowledge in John happens just before Passover. Like there's always a note about that, right? Quick, saying it's just before Passover, and then Jesus knew something that he didn't tell anybody. So is the issue that this ending necessitates that measure of the spring, and it has nothing to do with the Greek grass. So you have to rule out other possibilities and say the probability of these two things is so low that it's significant. Mm-hmm. And not just that, oh wow, it's neat. So like, and that's from the little I'm aware of it, that seems more like the tenor of it, like the oh wow.
I'm gonna have to send you the book if you are willing to take on a project, of course, at some point. I'd love to have you do a deeper dive with me. And what I notice about you that I love is you'll find things that really make you go, what? I'll give you an example, and I know you'll like this example. And I don't know the exact details of the example, but I watched a video because I was in my side time while I'm editing, while I'm recording, while I'm interviewing new scholars, while I'm reading new books. I've been trying to read up on some of the undesigned coincidences and get acquainted with the arguments being made. And there's a guy named Camille Gregor, and he loves getting into this stuff like me. And he said, let me show you an undesigned coincidence. And this had to do with the temple, the cleansing of the temple scenario. And in one of them, I can't remember the detail, but then he goes over to John and shows, hey, look, this looks like an undesigned coincidence that would fit right into the book. But the reason that these Christians, particularly Lydia and Tim McGrew, are not using these examples is because John is cleansing a temple at a completely different time than the other gospel. So they say that there are two cleansing of the temples in order to make it harmonize. And so, but it's clearly an undesigned coincidence, which in the synoptics somehow connects to the John narrative, but John has him doing it at a whole different time. These are issues. And it's like, what do you do with this? Well, ignore it or try to say, well, they can all be true at the same time. And this was the hiccup I had in my very immediate response was undesigned. Like, how is it undesigned when I'm like, it seems obvious. John knows Mark at the very least. And I would say all three synoptics, possibly at least two, because I don't know if Luke acts as later. I don't know if it's a rolling text. I don't know where to put my feet on this, but all I know is I'm fairly confident Matthew and Mark are in John, that Luke knows Matthew and or at least knows Mark for sure. If you take the the two source hypothesis. My point is they know what they're working with. They have previous literature. Why are we concocting this hypothesis when it seems more plausible that they're working off of a narrative than not? I don't know.
And how do you test undesigned? Like, I mean, I think you got right at it. Like, how do you can mark coincidences, and then there's a whole methodological discussion to be had there, but you can mark coincidences. How do you psychologize to say they're undesigned? Mm-hmm. That's not a testable hypothesis unless you know way more about the composition history of these texts.
And you being a mathematics guy, she gets into Bayes' theorem in her book, and I don't know jack diddly squat. So I'm going to send it to you, and we're going to talk off air about this. Last one, I think it is Discovering Ancient History with Pat Lowinger says, no, common sour wine was known as Pascha.
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, so it's the thing to keep in mind in the first century is there's not a lot of beverage options. There's like a lot stuff goes bad. And so you can have probably a lot of drinks that we would find just disgusting, but doesn't go bad. You can safely store it.
Right.
So that's the whole issue. That's why, everybody's drinking wine. I don't care if you're 5 kids, you're drinking the wine because we need the alcohol to kill the bacteria. Not that they know it's bacteria, but like we need it's safe. It's for the same reason we have juice with crap tons of sugar, but they didn't have the same access to sugar that we do. So okay, we'll just put some alcohol in it, and it will keep it from that. So yeah, it's so thanks for the comment. Thanks for clarifying me on the wine. I've just only now been starting to read up on the story of John 2 and the changing water into wine, and what I've been getting into is the alcohol levels. So there's lots of commentary on how strong was the alcohol, but I need to do more work on like, well, what are the actual distilling techniques? What are the types of drinks that were available?
And one more comment or comment before we go, and I want to plug you before we go, is have you read Dennis MacDonald's work, The Fourth Gospel, the Dionysian Gospel, he calls it?
Yeah.
Okay.
I've read a bit of it.
Okay. Is it like, are there some things you would say like, hey, there's some of the stuff I do think is interesting and it may be the case, and then maybe you don't draw all the connections, but
I would, from what I've seen, so I don't want to mischaracterize it, but from what I've seen, he does downplay the sort of messianic banquet more than I would. This idea of wine flowing as a symbol of the messianic age. Having said that, I don't think that you can dismiss Dionysus as something that John's playing off of just because John's Jewish. He's writing to people in an area of the world. If he's from Asia Minor, then he's really from an area of the world where Dionysus is very popular. So if he wants to tell a story, true or not, factual or not, if he wants to tell a story about Jesus turning water into wine, then he would have to know that people are going to think of Dionysus. And so to sort of swing the pendulum completely the other way and say Dionysus has nothing to do with it because we can explain it through messianic references in the Old Testament, I think is swinging the pendulum too hard. So I think if you go back 100 years, go back to 1922, the common hypothesis is that Jesus is adapting Dionysus.
Right.
Or John is adapting Dionysus. And then with the move toward sort of looking at the Jewish context of Jesus in the 20th century, it becomes this issue of, well, oh no, then we completely do away with Dionysus. I think that's when
Dennis he says that when we talk, he says, Derek, it's eclectic. He's like, it's not one or the other, it's both. And we're dealing with a Jewish Hellenistic world. So to pretend it's one or the other, he thinks, is just throwing baby out in the bathwater. Either way you go, we just need to keep the baby and the bathwater. And so we need to play with that. I really appreciate your time, Dr. Tripp. I can't recommend your books enough. Please, everybody, if you have 125 bones, go get a copy. If not, I understand. Trust me. But it's deep into the Gospel of John. Also, he has the Academia page, so be sure to go and follow him on Academia. You can check out some of his videos and his articles that he's written, which are on Academia. He has the YouTube, which is a YouTube channel where he puts out some of his content. Sounds like BS series. So subscribe to his YouTube channel. I'll put it in the chat right now for those of you who are still around. There is his YouTube channel. I lost him. He had broke up with the connection there. We also got the Patreon. I bust my hump. I can't tell you how hard I'm busting my hump. I have a video right now that is almost done editing. I'm working on it. Hopefully I can get it done today on the Patreon. So it's with Paula Fredrickson. It's a second video. We already have one. Got the lecture with Ancient Greek Mysteries with M. David Litwa. I've got the Finding Moses course that just came out for Bart Ehrman. That's coming soon. And we talked about earlier the Unknown Gospels I did with Bart Ehrman as well. I edited that in its final form. And the memory studies, you name it. He just texted me, said, Wi-Fi just bombed. Let me share one more little plug here to show you guys what I'm working on. Paula Fredrickson right now in the editor. I edit my own stuff. Sometimes I'll send it to Neil to have him do like all the pretty stuff to overlay it, get the story blocks, visuals, and stuff like that. But yeah, this video is approximately 28 minutes long. And I haven't put any of the overlay stuff that's going to go over our recording together. But this will be on Patreon. This is the second of 12. So I have, after this, 10 more that I will be, getting done, editing, sending out there on the Patreon. So help us out. I could really use it. I'm not just saying that. Every month, there's a drop-off of 30 or so people who aren't tied into the Patreon and they disappear. And I'm always doing something new. I hope that we can get Dr. Tripp to join us in really examining the undesigned coincidence stuff because he's so careful. Have you noticed how careful he is? Oh, he's back. Hold on, here we are. I was just talking crap about you. And
yeah, I know, I heard.
Yeah. I really, you're very careful. You focus on the details. You do the math. We've been on here for a long time, so I don't blame your Wi-Fi for wanting to say, screw you, I'm done. But yeah, you know what? Let's do this publicly. I'm going to put you on the spot.
Okay.
What are the odds I could get you hired project? Because I don't want you to do anything for free. To do a very deep examination of the undesigned coincidence position. And they're going to get into certain pericope, their examples, and you can give alternative explanations that maybe make better sense than the hypothesis they're promoting or proposing to begin with. What are the odds we could do something like that? If you mean negotiate. Off record, we'll negotiate. But could we make something happen?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay. What do you think of that, MythVision? You want to see something like that happen? Let me know. Comment now. Let me know. We missed you, so we didn't get you to do the outro or to say anything in particular. If you were to put a ribbon or a bow on the end of our conversation today, what would you encourage people to do?
If somebody is making a claim about them, about eyewitness testimony, question why, and question, like, what good does that do you? So, first of all, how do you know? They say, well, in John's case, he just says he is. Are there any reasons to question that? Especially within early Christianity, are there any reasons to doubt a claim when somebody says who wrote it, and especially doesn't give a name? So just says, this guy I like wrote it. How do you know that's John, the son of Zebedee? Which is what most conservative Christians are going to say. Or how do you know it's John the Elder? Or how do you know who it is? Without any data in the gospel. And if you are, and even if you do, if you say, okay, I'll grant you that an eyewitness wrote this, where does that get us? Is that going to do for you what you think it's going to do? I tend not to be that optimistic. Eyewitnesses have their own agendas, and John signals his own agenda very clearly. I wrote these things, whoever I am. I wrote these things so you would believe. Not so that you would have a complete record of the facts, not so you would have an impartial eyewitness testimony about things. I want you to believe, and so I chose these specific things and wrote them in a specific way so you would believe. And he's honest about that. And I guess I could be self-critical and say, should I doubt that claim? But I have no reason to doubt that claim. He has no reason to make that claim falsely. Whereas there is a motive. There's at least a motive and an opportunity to make the claim falsely that an eyewitness is behind the gospel. So being able to back it up would be better, but even if they could back it up, where does it get you? Eyewitnesses are not necessarily reliable, so we're still back to square one.
This is the problem. When I was a fundamentalist, it was true. Like, honestly, I'll give you an example right here. Jesus Lover 122. The Gospel of John is correct and God breathed. Like, that was me. That was me 12 years ago, and it was wholly, absolutely. But I would have approached the claims of Proculus Julius, the a senator or a Roman official who says that he witnessed Romulus. Was it Romulus? Yeah, it was. I think it was Romulus. I could be mistaken, but I thought it was Romulus. I might be talking about Julius Caesar, but I think it's
got off.
Huh?
Remus got off. Remus got the shaft.
Yeah, he got the crap. But Romulus, he is an eyewitness of what happened and that Romulus appeared to him and all this stuff. Like, I approached that as a Christian, like I approach Christianity's claim of eyewitness stuff to that the way I did, without that biased double standard or special pleading. I approached it like, and my ears perk up when you start telling me stuff like, he walked on water or he literally rose someone from the dead. Like, when I approached any other gods or any other religious claims or any other people that weren't within my bubble, I approached them as critical, like doubting what they said, as I do now with Christianity, if that makes sense.
And that's a good standard to have. Like, do I approach all texts the same or all claims the same? And if not, why not? Bauckham might say, well, that's all I'm asking is that, like, you trust, say, Plutarch talking about Nero. Why don't you trust John talking about Jesus? Well, to some extent, and this, like, speaking of what you're talking about, and this is something that's always sort of glanced over, is you may have one or two wild claims about a Caesar or a philosopher or something in a biography. But when you have wild claim after wild claim after wild claim, it's sort of your responsibility as the reader to question whether that's valid anymore. Like, okay, he's walking on water now. Like you said, if Alexander is walking on water, I'm going to start to doubt the truthfulness, the facticity of this story.
I have to read something for you, but go ahead, continue that thought.
But I mean, so whether or not, you could say, well, maybe the people writing it believe that Alexander walked on water, sure, but that doesn't mean that, like, you have to believe it actually happened.
Right.
And that's the problem, is this, what I was saying about the stakes being raised, because Christians who want to read the Gospels as factual accounts, and only as factual accounts, then behave differently based on that belief. And they want you to behave differently based on that belief. So that's where the problem is. So you behave differently and you want me to behave differently, then I'm going to need more than just trusting that he's right.
Same. Thank you for becoming a member, Dadville's Advocate. I really appreciate that. Seriously. I'm going to keep that up. I just wanted to tease people as we're leaving. Suetonius, Lives of the Caesars. Okay. I love this. In the Deified Augustus chapter, like, he goes through some stuff and you're like, I could see this is probably historical. Some of this here might actually go back to what actually occurred, or at least is said of what actually occurred, because it's not crazy. But then you read, and now that we're on this subject, it would not be irrelevant to add an account of the events before his birth, on the very day he was born, and subsequently from which could be drawn the hope and expectation of his greatness and enduring good fortune. When in ancient times part of the wall of Villatre had been touched by lightning, this was seen as a sign the citizen of the town would one day be ruler. Bolstered by this, the people of Villatre immediately waged war with the Roman people, and on many subsequent occasions too, almost to their own destruction. Finally, however, it became, now there might be something historical that there's an omen and people are crazy enough to go up against Rome and they almost get to their own destruction, right? But then here's where it gets interesting, where you should be like, hold on, dude, did this really happen? Where it says, bolstered by this, the people of Villatre immediately Rome. Okay. Finally, however, it became clear that this event had been a sign portending the power of Augustus. So now they're already cognitive dissonance starts to set in and go, oh, it was about Augustus being born. Julius Marathus records that a few months before Augustus was born, a prodigy was generally observed at Rome, which announced that nature was bringing forth a king for the Roman people. The Senate, he continues, was most alarmed and agreed that no child born in that year should be raised. However, those whose wives were pregnant ensured that the decree was not registered in the treasury, since each hoped that the prodigy referred to his own child. Sounds a lot like Jesus, doesn't it? I read in the books of Asclepiades of Mendes entitled Theologia that Attia, attending the sacred rites of Apollo in the middle of the night, had her litter positioned in the temple and fell asleep, while the other matrons were also sleeping. All of a sudden, a serpent slid up to her, then quickly went away. On waking, she purified herself as she would after sleeping with her husband, and at once there appeared on her body a mark in the image of a snake, and she never was able to get rid of it, so that ever afterward she avoided going to the public baths. Augustus was born 10 months later, and for this reason is believed to be the son of Apollo. And it starts to get even crazier when he's like, it's just one crazy thing after another. You're like, wow, it's cool. It's interesting. It's fun. It's powerful. It grabs your attention. But if you're not reading that going, come on, what's more plausible?
As you highlighted that point, he's like, this is what people said. So he's making a claim about claims. It's right. He distanced himself a bit. That's different from Matthew. This is what happened. And it's my belief that Matthew is far more Greco-Roman in his nativity scene than Luke is. And so it's would you could say this is based on eyewitness testimony, but the factual claim is that people claimed this, not that it actually happened. And that makes it a bit more believable. Right. I can believe that people made these claims. But when you're saying, well, this is actually what happened, then
I would need to go and read any earlier accounts. I mean, I'm just reading Suetonius, but I haven't even began to embark, because what I wanted to do is something unique. Oftentimes in scholarship, we don't focus on not scholarship. I mean, generally speaking, lay people aren't recognizing how contemporary ideas need to be really focused on. Even like Mark's gospel, when the Hermeneutic commentary is being written by Adela Collins, she's focusing on the Caesar cult. Like, how does the Roman imperial cult play a role in what's going on? And it seems to be aware of something going on there. Well, I wanted to go and take any claims of any of the Caesars and their deified state, apotheosis, their appearances, any miraculous claims, you name it, portents, the whole nine. And I wanted to build a devil's advocate kind of case, trying to show why we should believe in the Caesars and why they are really who they claim to be from eyewitness testimony. I want to do that at some point and build the strongest case where it's like, don't you see it? But obviously these were elitist that were buying into this stuff. So it's easy when the poor and the not educated and people at the bottom are buying into this totem pole that I'm going to just buy into what I'm being told here. And eventually it's convincing others. But I would love to build a case up at some point, see how that goes. So thank you, Jef, for your time. I really appreciate it, man. Everybody, check the description and never forget, we are MythVision. We humans have believed the earth